Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video, also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I was home alone. My family had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me to take care of the house. It wasn't anything new for me. I'd stayed alone before, and I actually enjoyed having the place to myself. The peace and quiet were a nice break from the usual chaos. I had a few chores to get done, but I figured I'd take my time, enjoy the solitude, maybe watch a movie later. I started with some laundry. There was this growing pile in the corner of my room, and I knew if I didn't take care of it now, I'd regret it later. So I grabbed the basket and made my way down to the laundry room in the basement. I've always hated our basement. It's cold, dimly lit, and just gives off an eerie vibe. But as always, I shook it off and got to work. I threw the clothes in the machine, started it up, and turned to head back upstairs. As I reached the top step, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling. You know how old houses can be. But there was something about it that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint, barely there, but it sounded like my name. A soft whisper, almost like someone exhaling the word through a thin sheet of air. Sarah? I stood frozen for a moment, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just hearing things, or it was some weird noise from the pipes. I knew I was alone. There was no one else in the house. I took a deep breath and continued upstairs, forcing myself to laugh it off. It was just my imagination. I sat down in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to distract myself with a show. But every now and then, I found myself glancing up at the ceiling, my mind wandering back to that sound. It was strange, but nothing to worry about, right? I was halfway through folding the laundry later that evening when I heard it again. Sarah. This time, it was clearer, but still soft, like it was coming from far away. I froze, laundry in hand, and listened carefully. It was coming from above me, from the attic. I'd never liked our attic. It was small, dusty, and we barely went up there. Mostly it was just for storage, old boxes of Christmas decorations, forgotten knickknacks, and things we never really used. The attic hatch was in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. You had to pull a cord to lower the rickety old ladder. I'd always avoided going up there, but now, standing there with that voice lingering in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked out into the hallway, staring up at the closed attic door. My pulse was racing. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft or something had shifted up there. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. There had to be a logical explanation, but the whisper kept repeating in my head. It had said my name, my name. I tried to brush it off, but every time I walked past the attic door, I swore I heard it again. A faint, almost inaudible voice calling my name, and every time I heard it, the pit in my stomach grew. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the hallway and stared up at the attic door again. My hand hesitated on the cord, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Just check, I muttered to myself. It's nothing, you'll see. With a shaky breath, I pulled the cord, and the ladder creaked as it unfolded. The attic door opened with a soft thud, and I stood there for a moment, staring up into the darkness. The air that drifted down was musty, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. I climbed up, one step at a time, shining the flashlight into the dark corners of the attic. Everything looked exactly as it should. Boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt a brief sense of relief. It really was just my imagination. But just as I was about to turn around and go back downstairs, I heard it again. Clear as day. Right next to my ear. Don't go. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. My heart was racing, pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The light flickered, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, but there was no one there. Just the same old boxes, the same clutter. But that voice, it had been so close, so real. I stood there, frozen, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing, searching for an explanation. but nothing made sense. There was no one up here, no one else in the house, and yet I'd heard it. I felt it. I turned to leave, desperate to get out of the attic, to be anywhere but there. But just as I reached the ladder, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more insistent. Stay. I bolted. I scrambled down the ladder, not caring if I slipped or fell, and yanked the attic door shut behind me. I stood in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, breathing heavily, my heart racing. I was shaking from head to toe, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I passed by the attic door, I felt a cold chill run down my spine, as if something was just waiting on the other side. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. All I could hear was that voice, whispering in the back of my mind, "Don't go." The next morning, I called my parents and told them everything. They tried to reassure me, said it was just my imagination, and every time, I wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed? If you think that was unsettling, the next story will leave you speechless. You know, it's strange how normal everything can seem right before something happens that flips your entire world upside down. I guess you could say that's how it all started for me. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. I was just getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth like I do every night, when I noticed something off. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the bathroom fan and the soft swishing of the toothbrush in my mouth. It was just me. I lived alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. The place wasn't much, but it was home, and I had always felt comfortable there. Safe. Anyway, I was standing there in front of the sink, staring into the bathroom mirror, my mind wandering like it always does when I'm brushing my teeth. I wasn't really paying attention to my reflection, just kind of zoning out, thinking about work and other mundane things. That's when I noticed it. Something wasn't right. I blinked a few times, trying to shake the fog out of my head, and that's when I realized what it was. My reflection wasn't moving. I mean, it was me. I was looking right at myself. But while I stood there, toothbrush in hand, my reflection just stayed still, like it was frozen. At first I thought maybe I was just tired. I mean, it had been a long day, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're exhausted, right? So I moved my arm slowly at first, just to see. And that's when my heart stopped. In the mirror, my arm didn't move. My reflection just stood there staring back at me as if it were waiting for something. I froze. For what felt like an eternity, I just stood there, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, staring at the mirror, waiting for it to, I don't know, catch up or something. But it didn't. My reflection stayed completely still, just staring at me with this blank, expressionless look on its face. I don't know how to describe the feeling that washed over me at that moment. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room, and this cold, creeping dread started to crawl up my spine. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to move, to look away, to do something. But I couldn't. I was frozen, locked in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. My reflection blinked. It moved, just like normal, mimicking my movements as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the mirror, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deeply, deeply wrong. I finally snapped out of it, rinsed my mouth, and hurried out of the bathroom, flicking the light off behind me. I didn't look at the mirror again that night. The next few days passed without incident. I kept telling myself it had been a trick of the light, or maybe just my tired mind playing games with me. I even laughed about it a couple of times, thinking how silly I was being, getting all worked up over nothing. But every time I went into the bathroom, I found myself glancing at the mirror, just to make sure everything was normal. And it was, for a while at least. Then a few nights later, it happened again. This time, I wasn't brushing my teeth. I had just finished showering, and I was standing in front of the sink, towel wrapped around my waist, wiping the fog off the mirror. The bathroom was steamy, and the air was warm and thick with the scent of soap. I reached up to dry my hair with the towel, glancing at the mirror as I did. And there it was again, my reflection, staring at me. But this time it wasn't just still, it was wrong. The way it was looking at me, it wasn't like before. Before, it had just been blank, expressionless, but now there was something in its eyes, something dark. It wasn't me. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it, deep in my gut. Whatever was in that mirror, it wasn't me. Not anymore. I dropped the towel and stumbled back, half my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could feel my chest tightening, and I thought for a second I was going to pass out. But I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. My reflection stood there, watching me. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were amused. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but eventually, I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran. I grabbed my clothes, threw them on, and got out of the apartment as fast as I could. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care that I probably looked like a lunatic, running out into the street with my hair still wet and my clothes half on. I just had to get out. I ended up staying at a friend's place for a few nights, making up some excuse about a plumbing issue in my apartment. I didn't tell them what had really happened. I couldn't. I didn't even know how to begin to explain it. When I finally went back home, I avoided the bathroom as much as possible. I started brushing my teeth in the kitchen, using the mirror in my bedroom to get ready in the mornings. I even thought about covering the bathroom mirror, but for some reason, that seemed even worse. Like it would give whatever was in there more power, if that makes any sense. Weeks passed and nothing happened. I started to feel a little more like myself, started to convince myself that maybe it really had been in my head. Maybe I was just stressed, overtired, maybe there was a logical explanation for all of it. But then last night it happened again. I had just gotten home from work and I was exhausted. I walked into the bathroom, not even thinking about the mirror. I flipped on the light and there it was, my reflection. But this time it didn't wait. It was already there, watching me, smiling. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. And then slowly, it raised its hand and waved. I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the floor, the bathroom light flickering overhead. I don't know how long I was out, but when I looked up, my reflection was gone. Everything was back to normal. I haven't been back in that bathroom since. I don't know what it wants or why it's doing this. But I do know one thing. Whatever is in that mirror, it isn't me. And I don't think it's going to stop. That was just a warm-up. The real terror begins with this next tale. I live on the 3rd floor of a pretty normal apartment building. You know the kind. Decent, clean, nothing too fancy. It's the kind of place where you hear your neighbors through the walls sometimes, but you've never really met them. Just passing faces in the hallway, muffled footsteps above, and the occasional smell of someone's dinner creeping through the vents. It's been my home for about 2 years now, and for the most part, it's been quiet and uneventful. Until last week. It was a typical Tuesday night. I had gotten home late from work, microwaved some leftovers, and collapsed on the couch with my cat, Milo. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I flicked through Netflix for something mindless to watch while I dozed off, the glow from the screen casting a soft light across the living room. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason at all. I looked at the clock, 3:13 a.m. Why is it always around 3 a.m.? Isn't that supposed to be the witching hour or something? I shook the thought off, groggy and trying to calm my racing heart. There was no reason to be freaked out. Milo was still curled up on the blanket next to me, breathing softly. Everything was fine. But as I lay there, trying to will myself back to sleep, something felt off. You know that feeling you get when you sense you're being watched? It's hard to describe, but it's like this itch you can't scratch, this tightness in your chest. I sat up, glancing around my dark apartment. Nothing seemed out of place. The curtains over the sliding glass door to the balcony. I froze. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a tree branch brushing against the window, or a bird. But I live on the 3rd floor. There aren't any trees that tall, and no way for anyone or anything to reach my windows unless they had a ladder. And I don't know about you, but I don't usually see birds tapping on windows at 3 in the morning. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound. It was coming from my bedroom window, which faces the back of the building. I couldn't see the window from the living room, but the tapping continued, soft and rhythmic. Milo stirred beside me, his ears twitching. He lifted his head and stared at the hallway that led to my bedroom. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, like he was seeing something I couldn't. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Cats always know, don't they? I didn't want to get up. I really didn't. But the tapping wasn't stopping, and I couldn't ignore it. So, I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and made my way slowly down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the doorway to my room, I stopped. The blinds over the window were drawn, but there was enough moonlight filtering through the gaps that I could make out a shadow, a figure standing just outside my window. I blinked, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, just standing, watching. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. There was no way anyone could be out there, not unless they had climbed up 3 stories or brought a ladder with them in the middle of the night. And even then, why? Why just stand there? My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. I reached blindly for my phone, fingers shaking as I fumbled with it, eyes still locked on the figure. But just as I was about to dial, the tapping stopped. The figure was gone. I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, staring at the empty space outside my window. My breath was coming in shallow, panicked gasps, and I was shaking all over. What the hell just happened? I don't know how long I stood there before I finally moved. I hurried over to the window and yanked the blinds all the way up, half expecting to see someone still standing there, but there was nothing. No ladder, no footprints, just the quiet night. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure standing there, just staring at me. The next day, it's been a week since then, and I haven't seen the figure again, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching. Every night, I make sure to close the blinds before bed, and I haven't opened them since. Milo sits by the window sometimes, staring at it like he's waiting for something to appear. I keep telling myself it was just a bad dream, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But every night, when I lie in bed, I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't? What if, one night, I wake up again and the figure is standing there, watching me from the other side of the glass? I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe I'll never know. But whatever it was, it left a mark on me, a constant gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, I'm not alone when I sleep. You think you've heard it all? Just wait. The next story is even more disturbing. It started about a month ago, on a quiet Tuesday night. I had been up late, working on a project that was due the next morning. My desk lamp cast a soft, yellow glow across the room, and the only sound was the gentle hum of my laptop's fan. It was one of those nights where the house feels strangely peaceful. Almost too peaceful, like the world outside has stopped moving. I was tired but determined to finish, pushing through the last few paragraphs of an essay. The clock on my screen read 1:53 a.m. when I finally leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes and stretching. I thought about calling it a night. My bed was only a few steps away, and the silence of the house was beginning to lull me into that sleepy haze. You know, the one where your body is so tired, but your mind is still buzzing? Then my phone rang. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just a random notification, but it wasn't. The phone rang again. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I glanced at my phone on the desk, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. The time read 2:01 a.m. It was strange, but not alarming. Wrong numbers happen all the time, right? I didn't think much of it. I let it ring, figuring whoever it was would realize they dialed the wrong number and hang up. But just as the ringing stopped, it started again. The same number. Now, I'm not one to answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, especially not in the middle of the night. But something about the persistence of it made me uneasy. After the third ring, I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice low, almost hesitant. There was nothing. No sound, no breathing, just an empty... The voice was barely more than a whisper, but clear enough that I froze in my chair. It was a woman's voice, soft and breathy, almost distant. My heart began to race, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I quickly hung up. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of prank, a creepy joke someone thought would be funny to play in the middle of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. I stood up from my desk, my legs feeling shaky, and walked to the window. The blinds were drawn, but I could feel the night pressing in from the other side of the glass. The street outside was dark and quiet, as it always was at this hour. I pulled the blinds open just a crack, peering out into the night. Nothing. No one. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road, and everything seemed still. Too still. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, twice. They were all secure, but that didn't make me feel any better. That voice, it was too clear, too real. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just some weird coincidence. I went back to my desk, but I couldn't focus anymore. I just sat there, staring at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Not that night, anyway. The next few days, I tried to forget about it. I really did. But every time my phone buzzed or rang, I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some random call. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. The way it said those words so softly, like it was right outside my window. I'm outside. Who was she? And why call me, of all people? Weeks passed, and I stopped thinking about it as much. The number never called again, and life returned to its usual rhythm. But every time I stayed up late, I found myself glancing at my phone, just waiting for that unknown number to flash on the screen again. Then, last night, it happened. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when my phone rang. The sound cut through the darkness, and my heart leaped into my throat. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. I answered, my hand trembling. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. And then, the static. Soft at first, like before, but growing louder, more distorted. I could hear faint noises buried in the static, whispers, maybe, or breathing. I ran to the door, checking the locks again, my mind racing. How could she be inside? I checked everything before going to bed. I always do. I grabbed my phone off the floor, ready to call the police, but when I checked the call log, there was no record of the call. No missed call, no incoming number, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside made me jump. Morning came, and with it, a strange sense of relief. The daylight felt like a shield, like nothing could hurt me while the sun was up. But that voice still haunts me. I don't know who she is or what she wants, and I'm not sure I want to find out. But every night as the sun sets and the house grows quiet again, I feel her presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time my phone rings. And I know one day it will. But next time, I'm not sure if I'll have the courage to answer. What you've heard so far is nothing compared to what's coming next. It was a regular Friday night, nothing special. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner, and I was settling into bed with my laptop to watch some old reruns. You know, the kind you've seen a million times, but they're comforting in a way. The clock on my bedside table read 11:43 p.m., and I remember feeling that wave of satisfaction knowing the weekend had finally arrived. No plans, no stress, just me, alone in my apartment. I live in a small town. It's not one of those creepy, isolated places with no neighbors or streetlights. No, it's quite the opposite, really. My building is in a normal neighborhood, a few blocks away from the local grocery store and a 24-hour gas station. There's always someone out walking their dog or driving by, even late at night. So while I was alone, I didn't feel isolated, at least not at first. It was right around midnight when I first heard it. A knock, not loud or forceful, but soft, persistent, tap, tap, tap. I paused my show and listened for a second, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. But there it was again, tap, tap, tap. I frowned and sat up in bed. Who would be knocking on my door this late? My friends knew better than to just show up unannounced, especially after midnight. Maybe it was a neighbor, but still, it was odd. The knocking wasn't frantic like someone in trouble. It was patient. Like whoever it was knew I was inside, and they weren't in a hurry to leave. I debated for a few moments, wondering if I should just ignore it. But curiosity got the best of me, and I climbed out of bed. I tiptoed down the short hallway toward the front door, every step making me more aware of the silence in my apartment. I hadn't noticed it before, but everything seemed unnaturally quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the usual sounds from the street outside, none of that was there, just quiet. I reached the door and stood there for a second, my hand hovering over the lock. The knocking had stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, like maybe I'd been imagining it, but also a bit unnerved by the idea that someone had been standing just outside my door a moment ago. I leaned forward to look through the peephole, my heart thudding a little harder than I'd like to admit. I was expecting to see nothing, to reassure myself that I'd just been paranoid, but when I pressed my eye to the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, just the dim, flickering light from the old ceiling fixture above. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. There was no one there. I straightened up, feeling silly. Maybe I'd just been hearing things. I was about to turn away and go back to bed when the knocking started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My stomach dropped. I spun around and looked through the peephole again. Still nothing, but the knocking kept going. It was so close, so real, but no one was there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty hallway as the tapping continued. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Open the door, call out, run back to my room and pretend none of this was happening? But then, as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I waited, breath held, expecting it to start again, but the silence returned. Just silence. I stepped back from the door, confused and more than a little freaked out. It was late. I was tired. Maybe I was just hearing things. That had to be it, right? I turned off the lights in the hallway and went back to bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knocking to return. But it didn't. Eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of my alarm blaring. It was morning, bright sunlight streaming in through the blinds. The night before felt distant, almost like a bad dream. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, no one had actually been there. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by the time night rolled around again, I had almost forgotten about the knocking. Almost. I went about my evening as usual, made dinner, watched TV, checked my phone, and eventually I went to bed. But as soon as the clock hit midnight, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart jumped into my throat. I bolted upright in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. The same knock, soft, persistent, like before. I stared at the door from my bed, too scared to move this time. I didn't want to go check, didn't want to look through the peephole and see that empty hallway again. But the knocking kept going. Tap, tap, tap. It was maddening. I couldn't just sit there and listen to it all night. I forced myself to get up, every step feeling heavier than the last. I reached the door and stood there, trembling. I pressed my eye to the peephole, expecting, dreading what I would see. And just like before, there was no one there. But the knocking, it hadn't stopped. I stood frozen, staring into the empty hallway, my mind racing. What was happening? Was someone playing a prank? Was I losing my mind? I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the knocking stopped again. And that was it. Silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. For the next few days it was the same routine. Midnight came, and so did the knocking. Every time, it was the same. Tap, tap, tap. Always just after midnight, always stopping as soon as I checked the door. No one was ever there. I stopped telling myself it was just my imagination. Something was happening, but I had no idea what. I couldn't explain it, and that terrified me more than anything. After a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's place for a few nights. I didn't tell them why. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But after a couple of nights away, with no knocks, no tapping, I started to feel better. Maybe it was something about my apartment. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, some sort of noise from the pipes or the building itself. I went back home, feeling a little more confident that whatever had been happening was over. The first night back was quiet. No knocking, no tapping. I I slept better than I had in days. But then, the second night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I didn't even bother getting out of bed. I just lay there, staring at the door, heart pounding in my chest. The knocking didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I never figured out what caused the knocking. I tried everything, talking to my landlord, checking the pipes, even asking my neighbors if they'd heard anything. But no one else had heard the knocking. It was only ever me. Eventually, it stopped on its own. I don't know why. Maybe whatever it was got bored, or maybe it just moved on to someone else. But even now, years later, every time I hear a soft knock at the door, my heart skips a beat, and I'm reminded of those nights. And I still don't have an explanation. If you thought you could handle the last one, think again. This next story will test your nerves. I live in a modest apartment with 2 roommates, Ben and Sarah. It's nothing special, a standard 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. It's affordable, close to campus, and convenient for all of us. We're not super close, but we get along well enough. We have our own routines, and for the most part, we respect each other's space. Everything was pretty normal until a few weeks ago. It started with the footsteps. I was in my room late one night, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I heard the sound of someone walking down the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was around midnight, and either Ben or Sarah could have been up for a midnight snack or to use the bathroom. But the more I listened, the weirder it felt. The footsteps were slow, almost dragging. I could hear them shuffle from the living room to the kitchen, then stop. I waited for the usual sounds that follow, like the fridge opening or a cupboard creaking, but nothing, just silence. The next morning, over breakfast, I casually mentioned hearing someone walking around late last night. Ben looked up from his cereal and shook his head. Nah, man, I didn't get up at all. I was knocked out after studying. Sarah furrowed her brow. I went to bed early. Are you sure you weren't just hearing things? I shrugged it off, laughing a little. Yeah, maybe. It was late. I probably imagined it. But as the days went on, the strange sounds continued. I'd be in my room, or sitting on the couch watching TV, and I'd hear faint noises, footsteps, the fridge door creaking open, or the soft click of a light switch. Every time I got up to check, the kitchen would be empty, the hallway silent. Ben and Sarah always seemed genuinely confused when I asked them about it, claiming they hadn't been awake or even home. One night, the sounds were louder. I could hear someone shuffling around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets. The clink of utensils followed, like someone was preparing a meal. I hesitated, trying to tell myself it was just Ben or Sarah. But something about the rhythm of the sounds felt off. It wasn't the casual clatter of someone grabbing a quick snack. It was methodical, deliberate, like someone trying to make too much noise but failing miserably. I got up, walked down the hallway, and peeked into the kitchen. It was empty. No sign of anyone. The lights were off, the fridge was closed, and everything was in its place. My heart pounded as I slowly backed away, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Things escalated after that night. I'd be lying in bed, just about to drift off to sleep, when I'd hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my door. Sometimes they would stop right in front of my room, and I'd hold my breath, waiting for the door to creak open. But it never did. One evening, I was studying late in the living room, and Ben had gone out for the night. Sarah was in her room with the door closed, probably asleep. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and then, out of nowhere, I heard it, the fridge door opening. I froze, my eyes locked on the darkened kitchen. I hadn't heard anyone get up. I hadn't seen Sarah leave her room. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. The fridge door was wide open. No one was there. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly slammed the door shut and rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I asked Ben and Sarah again. Neither of them had any explanation. Ben laughed it off, saying I was probably just sleep-deprived. Sarah, on the other hand, looked a little more serious, as if she was starting to believe something wasn't right. The final straw came a week later. It was late again, around 1 a.m., and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those damned footsteps, pacing back and forth, back and forth. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it out. But then I heard something new, a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe someone talking on the street outside. But it grew louder, more distinct, like it was coming from the hallway. I strained to listen, but I couldn't make out the words. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly opened my door. The hallway was empty, as usual, but the whispering continued, almost like it was moving away from me, toward the kitchen. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen light was off, but the moonlight streaming through the window gave the room an eerie glow. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. Nothing. And then, the fridge door creaked open. I swear, I saw it with my own eyes. There was no one there, but the door swung open slowly, almost as if someone had gently pulled it. I froze, my feet glued to the floor. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Ben or Sarah. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew something was wrong. Something or someone was in this apartment with us. I could feel it, sense it, but I had no idea who or what it was. I still hear the footsteps sometimes, the whispers too. Ben and Sarah act like nothing's changed, but I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone here. I've stopped asking them about it. They'll never believe me, but I know what I've heard, what I've seen. I don't know who or what is living with us, but it's here. And it's not going away. The fear is only growing. Brace yourself for what's about to come. I remember the day it all started, like it was yesterday. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that felt like any other. My friends and I had spent most of the day wandering around, just killing time as we often did. There wasn't much to do in our small town, and with the woods so close, it became our go-to spot for exploration. There was this old, overgrown path that cut through the trees, winding further than we'd ever gone before. We had always talked about following it, but something about it had kept us from venturing too far. Until that day. We were bored, and one of my friends, Kyle, dared us to see where the path led. We were a group of 4 that day: me, Kyle, Emily, and Josh. We joked around, pushing each other as we walked deeper into the woods. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the forest was swallowing up the usual sounds of birds and wind. It didn't feel right, but we were all too stubborn to turn back. After what felt like an hour of walking, we stumbled upon something none of us expected. It was a small cemetery, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and tangled bushes. The gravestones were worn, some tilted, with moss creeping over the names. Most of them were dated back to the 1800s. We immediately started reading the names, trying to guess the stories of the people buried there. It was a little eerie, but nothing too strange. At least, not yet. There was one grave, though, that caught all of our attention. It wasn't like the others. Instead of a carved name or date, there was just an unmarked stone, plain and cold. No words, no symbols, just a slab of rock standing in the middle of the cemetery. Kyle, being the loudmouth he was, made some dumb joke about it being the grave of someone nobody wanted to remember. Emily laughed, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. Why wasn't there any information? Was this person forgotten on purpose? Josh tried to change the subject by suggesting we head back, but Kyle was already on one knee, mimicking some kind of mock prayer at the stone. He was never one to take anything seriously. "Hey, maybe this is where they buried a witch or something," he laughed. Emily joined in, but I couldn't laugh. Something about that unmarked stone gave me a deep, sinking feeling in my stomach, like we were trespassing on something we weren't meant to find. We stayed for another few minutes, but I was already itching to leave. We made our way back, the tension from the cemetery hanging in the air, even though no one mentioned it. By the time we got back to town, the sun was starting to set, and we all split up to head home. I thought I'd be able to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the image of that unmarked stone from my mind. That night, I went to bed like normal. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then came the dream. At least I think it was a dream. It felt so real that even now I'm not sure. In the dream, I was back at the cemetery, standing in front of that same unmarked stone. Everything was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. I was alone. My friends were nowhere to be seen. I was staring at the stone, trying to figure out why it was there when I felt something behind me. Slowly, I turned around, and there she was, a woman, standing just a few feet away from me. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, and her long dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were what scared me the most, wide, empty, like she wasn't really looking at me, but through me. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, pointing at the unmarked stone. Her finger was trembling slightly, as if it took all her effort to lift her hand. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, forced to stand there and watch her. Then, without warning, she stepped closer, her feet barely making a sound on the ground. She was so close now that I could feel the cold radiating from her. She pointed at me this time, her expression still blank, but somehow I could tell she wanted something from me. I woke up with a jolt, my heart racing and my skin covered in sweat. The clock on my nightstand said it was 3:14 a.m. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, but the room felt off. There was this heaviness, like I wasn't alone. I glanced toward the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow pass by. I rubbed my eyes and shook my head. It had to be my imagination, right? I didn't go back to sleep that night. I couldn't. The dream, or whatever it was, stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next day, I told my friends about it, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably because we'd been talking about the cemetery so much. I tried to laugh along, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few nights later, I had the dream again. This time, it was worse. The woman was closer, her face pale and drawn, like she hadn't slept in years. She pointed at me again, but this time, her mouth moved, though no sound came out. It was like she was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, the same sense of dread hanging over me. It didn't stop there. Over the next week, the dreams came every night. Each time, the woman was closer, her expression more desperate, her finger still pointing at me. I started to dread going to bed. I didn't want to see her again, but every time I closed my eyes, there she was. It wasn't just the dreams either. Weird things started happening around the house. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway at night, but when I got up to check, no one was there. The doors would creak open on their own, and I'd find cold spots in random places, even though it was the middle of summer. My family didn't notice anything, or if they did, they didn't. One night, I woke up to a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was a soft knocking, coming from the window. I didn't want to look, but something made me turn my head. Outside, in the dark, I saw her. The woman from my dreams. She was standing just outside my window, her face pale and hollow, her finger tapping against the glass. She wasn't moving, just staring at me, her eyes wide and empty. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there, paralyzed with fear, watching her as she pointed at me through the glass. Then, without warning, she disappeared, melting into the darkness. That was the last time I saw her, but I haven't been the same since. I never went back to that cemetery, and neither did my friends. We don't talk about it anymore. It's like we've all agreed to pretend it never happened, but I know it did. I can feel it. I still dream about her sometimes. She's always there, standing in the shadows, pointing at me. I don't know what she wanted, and I don't think I ever will, but I can't shake the feeling that something was left unfinished. And every now and then, late at night, I hear that same soft knock on the window. Just when you think it can't get worse, the next story proves you wrong. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. I mean, I enjoy a good horror movie now and then, but that's just fiction, right? That stuff doesn't happen in real life. At least that's what I always thought. But after last week, I'm not so sure anymore. It started with a normal day at work. I'm a graphic designer for a marketing company, and my job is pretty straightforward. Sometimes when there's a big project deadline, I have to stay late to get everything done. Most people in the office clear out by 6, but I don't mind the quiet. In fact, I prefer it. No distractions, no one popping into my cubicle to chat. It's just me, my computer, and the sound of my keyboard clicking away. Last week, we had this huge campaign due, and I was behind on my part of the design work. I knew I'd have to stay late, and honestly, I didn't think twice about it. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I sent a quick text to my roommate, letting him know I'd be home late, and settled in for a long night. The office felt normal at first, a little too quiet maybe, but that's to be expected when you're the last person in the building. Around 8 p.m., I got up to stretch my legs and grab another cup of coffee. That's when I noticed it for the first time, the cold spot. I wasn't really paying attention at first. I just figured the air conditioning had kicked in, but then I realized something was off. The whole office was a comfortable. I walked around a bit, trying to see if maybe the AC vent was blowing directly on me, but no, that wasn't it. Everywhere else was warm, except for this one spot that seemed to follow me whenever I moved. I could feel the chill on the back of my neck, and it gave me the creeps. But I shrugged it off. It was late, I was tired, and I still had a lot of work to do. I figured maybe I was just imagining things. After all, I'd been staring at my screen for hours, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're tired. The next night, I had to stay late again. I wasn't exactly looking forward to it, but deadlines are deadlines. I got to the office around 7, and it was already dark outside. The place was even quieter than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But that's ridiculous, right? There's no one else here. I sat down at my desk, trying to focus on the project, but my mind kept drifting back to that cold spot from the night before. I glanced around, half expecting to feel that chill again, but everything seemed normal. I told myself it was just a weird fluke and got back to work. About an hour later, I felt it again. That cold, icy feeling creeping up my spine. But this time, it was stronger. It wasn't just a cold spot near my desk. It was like the air around me had dropped 10 degrees. And then I felt something brush against my arm. At first, I thought it was my sleeve, maybe caught on the edge of my chair or something. But no, this was different. It was soft, almost like someone had lightly touched me. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around the office, but of course, no one was there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, this faint sound, like a whisper. It was so quiet I almost missed it, but it was there, just behind me. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stood up so fast that my chair nearly tipped over. I looked around, but the office was empty. The lights were still on, my computer was still running, but there was this thick, eerie silence hanging in the air. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I realized I was sweating, despite the cold. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door. I didn't even bother shutting down my computer. I just needed to get out of there. As I walked down the hallway towards the elevator, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just that same heavy silence. The elevator ride down felt like it took forever. When the doors finally opened, I practically ran to my car. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing there. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I haven't stayed late at the office since. I make sure to finish my work during regular hours, and if I do have to stay late, I leave before it gets dark. I haven't told anyone at work about what happened. I mean, what would I even say? Hey guys, I think there's a ghost in the office. They'd think I'd lost it. But I can't shake the feeling that something is off. Every time I walk past my desk, I feel a chill, even during the day. It's subtle, but it's there. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. I don't know what it was, and maybe I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'm never staying late at that office again. What if I told you the scariest part is still ahead? Well, it is. Here comes the next story. I'm not the type to believe in ghost stories. I've always been the logical one, the guy who brushes off bumps in the night as nothing more than the wind or a creaky house. But what happened last summer in the woods, I still don't have an explanation for it. And the more I think about it, the less I want to find one. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a camping trip with a few of my closest friends. We'd been planning it for weeks. Nothing extravagant, just a couple of tents, a fire pit, and a clear sky full of stars. I needed the break, and so did they. Life had gotten pretty busy for all of us, and we figured a weekend away from the city would be a great way to relax. The forest we chose was only about an hour's drive from home. It was the kind of place families visit for a day hike, but it had a few spots where you could camp overnight. We weren't deep into the wilderness, but far enough that once the sun went down, the only light came from our fire and the moon. The first day was perfect. We arrived, set up our tents, and spent the afternoon fishing at a small stream nearby. By the time evening rolled around, we were sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and joking about how terrible we all were at camping. It was exactly what I needed, a simple, carefree weekend with good company. But as the night stretched on, something changed. I was sitting closest to the fire, staring into the flames, when I thought I saw movement in the trees. It wasn't much, just a flicker, like someone or something had passed between the trunks. I glanced up quickly, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I figured it was my imagination, or maybe an animal. This was the forest, after all. There were bound to be deer or raccoons wandering around. Still, the image stuck with me. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a face, pale, almost glowing, but gone in the blink of an eye. It unsettled me, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound like an idiot, especially when everyone else was having such a good time. The next morning, I forgot about it. We spent the day exploring more of the forest, swimming in the stream, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. It was a break from the constant noise of the city, and I found myself relaxing more as the hours passed. But that night, the second night, it got worse. We were back around the fire, just like before, when my friend Mark spoke up. "Did anyone else hear that last night?" "Hear what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "I don't know," Mark said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought I heard whispering, like really faint, coming from the woods." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What kind of whispering?" I couldn't make out the words, he admitted, but it didn't sound like the wind. It was weird. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but it felt real. We all exchanged glances, the mood around the fire suddenly shifting. No one laughed it off. No one told Mark he was crazy. In fact, Sarah, who had been quiet all evening, spoke up next. "I heard it too." My stomach twisted. This was starting to feel too familiar. "When?" I asked her. "Early in the morning, just before dawn," she said, her voice low. It was soft, but I know I heard it, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I didn't say anything, but my mind immediately went back to the face I thought I saw the night before. I hadn't heard whispering, but the feeling of being watched, that was real enough. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and we all sat there, staring into the flames like they held some kind of answer. I could tell no one wanted to admit it, but we were all starting to feel the same thing. Something wasn't right. That night, after we turned in, I lay awake in my tent, listening. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, watching, waiting. And then I heard it. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like wind moving through the trees. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was whispering. Soft, indecipherable words, like a conversation happening just beyond my understanding. I strained to hear, but no matter how hard I focused, I couldn't make out what was being said. My skin crawled. I wanted to wake up Mark or Sarah, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was like my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the strange, eerie sounds drifting through the night. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, just my imagination running wild after Mark's story. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and much too close. They were coming from just outside my tent, crunching softly over the forest floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying that I was dreaming. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled my tent, pausing for a moment before continuing again. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath shallow as I lay completely still. And then the whispering grew louder. It was right outside my tent now, the voices too close for comfort. They weren't friendly. There was something wrong with them, something twisted and malicious. I don't know how else to explain it, but I could feel it. Whatever was out there, it didn't want us here. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Eventually, the footsteps and whispering faded, disappearing into the distance. But even after they were gone, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I wasn't the only one who looked like they hadn't slept. Mark and Sarah both had dark circles under their eyes, and even Jack, who never believed in anything paranormal, looked uneasy. We packed up quickly, no one saying much. The fun, carefree atmosphere we'd had on the first day was gone. There was no more talk of staying an extra night. We all wanted to leave, and fast. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt ominous. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that pale face again, or hear the whispering voices following us. But we made it out of the woods without incident. I don't know what happened that weekend, and I don't think I ever will. We've never talked about it since. It's like we all silently agreed to pretend it didn't happen. But I haven't been camping since. I can't bring myself to go back into the woods. Because even though I don't have an explanation, I know what I felt that night. And whatever it was, it's still out there. The chills were just the beginning. What happens next will haunt you even more. I moved into this old house a few months ago. It was exactly what I was looking for. Affordable, quiet, and just far enough from the city to make me feel like I had some space to breathe. The landlord, Mrs. Henderson, was an elderly woman who seemed a little too eager to get the place rented. But I figured it was just because the property was old and not exactly modern. The kind of place that might have been grand a century ago, but was now just a little too creaky and outdated for most people's tastes. I didn't mind the creaks. The house had character. It had that old-world charm with wooden floors, stained glass windows. Everything was fine for the first couple of weeks. I set up my life, got my furniture in place, hung up a few pictures, and even started a small herb garden in the backyard. The only thing that seemed a little strange was the basement. There was a door down there, a heavy, old wooden door that was always locked. I asked Mrs. Henderson about it once, and she told me it was just an old storage room, nothing important, and not to worry about it. She didn't seem like the type to lie, so I didn't think much of it. I had no reason to go poking around anyway. The basement was dark, damp, and honestly a little creepy. Exactly what you'd expect from a house this old. Still, every now and then, I would hear noises from behind that door. It wasn't all the time, just once in a while, and it was subtle at first. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? But the sounds were odd. They weren't creaks or groans like wood shifting. It sounded like someone or something moving around in there, like pacing or shuffling. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there were rats or something in the walls. The house was old after all, but the more I heard it, the harder it became to ignore. It was never loud or obvious, just enough to make me stop whatever I was doing and listen. One night, I was watching TV in the living room when I heard it again. A faint, almost rhythmic sound coming from the basement. This time, it was clear enough that I couldn't just write it off. It wasn't my imagination. I muted the TV and sat there for a moment, listening. The sound was so subtle, but it was there. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking behind that locked door. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe the sound of water pipes or the wind outside, but it didn't feel right. Curiosity, or maybe a sense of dread, got the best of me. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, just in case, and made my way to the basement. The basement stairs creaked under my feet as I descended. The air grew colder the further down I went. The door stood there, just as it always had, solid, heavy, and unyielding. I hesitated for a second before approaching it. I didn't really want to know what was behind it, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check. I reached for the doorknob, gave it a twist, and just like always, it didn't budge. Locked. I stood there, staring at the door, my hand still resting on the cold brass knob. That's when I heard it, a faint knock from the other side. It was so soft, I wanted to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the basement, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. For a moment, I considered trying to break the door down to see what was on the other side. But something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like a deep sense of dread, like I shouldn't mess with whatever was behind that door. Some things are better left alone. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the door, and made my way back up the stairs. I didn't go back to the basement that night, or the night after that. In fact, I started avoiding it altogether. I didn't even go down there to do laundry anymore. I figured I could get by with a laundromat for a while. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened either. I didn't want to sound crazy. Weeks went by, and I didn't hear the noises again. Things started to feel normal again. I almost convinced myself that it had been my imagination. Maybe it had been rats or something in the walls. But then, one night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like a distant thudding. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets up over my head, but it got louder. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from the basement, the knocking, faster this time, more insistent. And then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was muffled, barely a whisper, but I could hear it. Someone was calling my name. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed Mrs. Henderson. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I was alone. I wanted to leave, to grab my keys and run out the door, but something kept me there. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to know what was behind that door. So, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I made my way down to the basement one last time. The knocking stopped as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The door was as still and silent as ever. I reached out for the doorknob again, my hands shaking. I didn't expect it to turn, but this time, it did. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness. I shined my flashlight into the room, but it was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no rats. Just an empty, dusty room. But the air in there was heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on me. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. A faint, whispering voice calling my name. I dropped the flashlight and ran. To this day, I don't know what was behind that door. And I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was in that house with me. Something that didn't want me there. And I don't think it's ever really left. If that story made your heart race, the next one will leave you breathless. It was a Tuesday night, a night like any other. I'd gotten home late from work, my head throbbing with the remnants of an all-day meeting that should have ended hours earlier. The clock in the living room showed 11:15 p.m. I hadn't even bothered to change out of my work clothes. I just threw my bag onto the couch, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed into the soft cushions. The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. More like the kind of silence that amplifies the creaks and groans of an old house. I'd moved into this place a few months ago. It was a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, affordable but old. I didn't mind the age at first. I was just happy to have my own space after living in cramped apartments for so long. It was my own little corner of the world. Anyway, I was sitting there on the couch, mindlessly flipping through channels. You know how it is when you're tired but too wired to sleep. I wasn't really watching anything in particular. The noise of the TV was just background to fill the quiet. That's when I heard it. A faint knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost hesitant tap. At first, I thought I imagined it. I mean, who knocks on someone's door that late at night? I brushed it off as one of those random noises old houses make. Maybe the wind rattling a loose shutter or something. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. My heart started to race a little, a prickling sensation creeping up my neck. It's strange, right? There's something unsettling about an unexpected knock at the door, especially when you're not expecting anyone. I muted the TV and listened. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the clock on the wall. My hand hovered over the remote, as if keeping the TV muted would somehow help me hear better. After what felt like a long time, I got up and walked toward the door. My feet felt heavy, like they didn't really want to go, but curiosity, or maybe something else, pushed me forward. The hallway was dark, and I hadn't turned on the porch light. As I approached the door, I noticed how quiet everything was outside. Usually, you could hear distant traffic or the faint sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, maybe someone's TV through an open window. But tonight there was nothing. I reached the door and hesitated. My hand was on the doorknob, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I don't know why, but I felt a strange sense of dread, like something was wrong. Still, I couldn't just ignore it, right? I leaned toward the peephole, pressing my eye against it. I expected to see, well, someone. A late-night visitor, maybe a neighbor who needed something. But there was nothing, just the empty front yard and the dark street beyond. The porch was empty, and the light from the street lamp barely illuminated the edge of my driveway. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was some prank? Kids messing around? But no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I turned the doorknob slowly, cracking the door open just a sliver. Cold air rushed in, making me shiver. I poked my head out, glancing around. Nothing. But just as I started to pull the door shut, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were clear. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving away from my house. I couldn't see where they were coming from, but I could hear them fading into the distance, as if someone had just been standing right at my door and was now walking away. My pulse quickened, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaky fingers. I stood there for a moment, back against the door, trying to calm my breathing. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why would someone knock and then just leave without saying anything? And where had they gone? I stayed by the door for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. Finally, I forced myself to walk away, back to the living room. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me after a long, stressful day. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I sat back down on the couch, turning the volume on the TV back up, hoping the sound would drown out the creeping sense of paranoia. For a while, it worked. I got lost in the noise of the sitcom rerun playing on the screen, trying to forget what had just happened. Then a few minutes later, there it was again. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach dropped. It was the same knock, faint but distinct. My mind was racing now. Who was doing this, and why? I didn't get up this time. I just sat there, staring at the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I waited for the footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come. Just silence. And then another knock, louder. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, my hands trembling as I hit the buttons. But just as I pressed the call button, the knocking stopped. My finger hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do. No one would believe me. It was probably just a prank, right? But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, almost whispering voice from the other side of the door. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the voice stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the room felt still again. The TV was still playing, but I wasn't paying attention to it. My mind was focused on the door, on what or who was on the other side. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I stayed up, sitting on the couch, phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the knocking to come back. But it didn't. The rest of the night was silent. The next morning, when the sun finally started to rise, I mustered up the courage to open the door and look outside. There was no sign that anyone had been there. No footprints, no disturbances, just the quiet street and the early morning light. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't heard the knocking again. But every night, as I sit in my house, I find myself glancing at the door, waiting, listening. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear those footsteps, faint but deliberate, somewhere in the distance, slowly getting closer. If you thought that sent chills down your spine, just wait for what's next. You know that feeling when you're in a place that's too quiet? Like the silence is so heavy that it starts to feel wrong? That was exactly how I felt when I was house-sitting for my Aunt Carol. She had asked me to look after her place while she went on vacation for a week. The house was a bit out in the countryside, secluded, but not entirely isolated. I had been there many times before, usually for family gatherings or holidays, so it wasn't like I was unfamiliar with it. Just a regular two-story house, nothing creepy about it, at least not during the day. The first 2 nights were completely normal. In fact, they were kind of nice. It felt like a mini vacation for me, too. I had the house to myself, ordered some takeout, watched movies late into the night, and slept in her big comfy bed. The house was cozy, and I didn't have any reason to feel uneasy. But then the third night came. It started off like any other night. I'd spent most of the evening watching TV in the living room, mindlessly flipping through channels. I was getting ready to head upstairs when I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but when I muted it, I heard it again, like footsteps coming from upstairs. I paused for a moment, listening. The sound was faint but unmistakable. You know how when you're alone, your mind immediately tries to rationalize things? It's just the house settling, I told myself. Maybe an animal in the attic? It didn't sound like an animal, though. But trying to stay calm, I went upstairs to check. I didn't find anything. The bedrooms were just as I'd left them, and there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I even peeked into the attic, but there was nothing there either. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, probably because the house was so quiet. I went back downstairs to the living room and settled back on the couch. That's when I noticed something strange. My phone, which I had left on the coffee table, was now on the armrest of the couch. I knew I hadn't moved it. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to remember if I had accidentally put it there without realizing it. But no, I hadn't touched it since I sat down to watch TV earlier. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had nudged it without thinking. The next hour or so passed without incident. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint noise from upstairs. Footsteps again, or something scraping. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the tension was building inside me. You ever get that feeling like someone's watching you? That's how I felt, even though I was completely alone. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't handle the uneasy feeling anymore. I figured I'd go upstairs, get into bed, and sleep it off. But as I was about to head up, I noticed something else. One of the cushions on the couch was moved. Like, noticeably moved. I hadn't touched it, but it wasn't where it had been earlier. Now I was starting to freak out. I stood there, staring at the couch, trying to think of any possible explanation. Maybe I had accidentally shifted it when I got up. Maybe there was some draft that had moved it. My brain was working overtime to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to fit. I walked around the house again, checking every door and window. Everything was locked. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. Still, the unease was growing. I grabbed a kitchen knife. Not that I knew what I'd do with it, but it made me feel a little better. And I went to bed, leaving the lights on. Lying there, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Soft creaks, almost like someone was walking around upstairs again. But every time I mustered the courage to get up and check, there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep, though it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up every hour, listening for the noises, waiting for something to happen. By the time morning finally came, I was mentally and physically drained. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone in a strange house. Maybe the noises were the pipes, or the wind, or something else equally harmless. But that night, as the sun set and the house fell into silence again, the fear crept back in. I settled into the living room once more, knife within arm's reach, determined to make it through the night without losing my mind. I told myself that I was going to be rational about it this time. No jumping at shadows, no getting spooked by every little noise. But then, as I sat there, I heard it again, the footsteps. Only this time, they were closer, and they weren't upstairs. They were coming from the hallway. My heart started pounding and I froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking towards the living room. I gripped the knife tightly, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it. There couldn't be anyone in the house. I had checked, double-checked, triple-checked every door and window, but the footsteps kept coming. I stood up slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and stepped towards the hallway. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't see anything. The hallway was empty. For a moment, I just stood there, waiting for something. anything to happen. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a whisper. A low, barely audible whisper coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, knife raised, but there was no one there. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I grabbed my phone, my bag, and bolted out the front door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. I drove to the nearest hotel and stayed there for the rest of the week. When my aunt came back from vacation, I told her everything. She looked at me like I was crazy, but I swear I wasn't imagining it. Something was in that house with me. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. I haven't been back to that house since, and I don't plan on ever going back. Even now, whenever I think about it, I get that same feeling of being watched. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. But deep down, I know something wasn't right in that house. Something was there with me. And whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. You think that was unsettling? The next story will keep you up all night. I've always been a creature of habit. Every evening after work, I lace up my sneakers and head out for a jog. It helps me clear my mind, unwind from the day, and honestly, it's a break from the constant chatter of my daily routine. The world feels quieter when I'm running, like I can finally hear my own thoughts. About 6 months ago, I found this great wooded trail near my house. It's the perfect escape, just far enough away from the busy streets to feel like a different world, but close enough to be practical. The trail winds through thick trees, the path cushioned by fallen leaves, and the sound of birds and rustling branches is all that breaks the silence. Peaceful, right? I loved it. I was there every evening without fail. It was about a month ago when things started to get weird. It was just like any other evening. I'd left the house around 6 p.m., a bit later than usual, but still enough daylight left to enjoy the trail before dusk. The air was cool, the sky painted with the soft colors of sunset, and as I jogged, I got lost in the rhythm of my footsteps, my breathing, the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes. I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point I felt off, like the air was different, heavier somehow. It's hard to explain, but I just couldn't shake this feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to brush it off. It's a trail, right? Maybe another jogger was behind me, or someone walking their dog. I glanced back casually, but no one was there. Just empty trees and shadows stretching as the light faded. I sped up a bit, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but the feeling lingered. This strange, prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow just ahead, darting between the trees. It was fast, so fast that at first I thought it was just a trick of the light or maybe a deer. But it wasn't. I slowed down, my heart racing, and scanned the area. Nothing. The woods were completely still, not even the usual rustling of leaves. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, straining to hear anything that might explain what I'd seen. But there was only silence. I should have turned back. I should have just left, but I didn't. I started running again, faster this time, telling myself that I was just jumpy. Maybe it was a squirrel or a bird or even another person, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But the feeling, the unease, kept building. Every step I took felt heavier, like something was slowing me down. My legs were working, my body was moving, but my mind was screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to get out of there. I ignored it, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine, someone else's. They were light, quick, and close. Too close. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears, and spun around. Again, nothing. No one was there, but I swear I heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I stood there, frozen, scanning the trees, waiting for something, anything to happen. But everything was still, too still. My breath came in short, panic bursts as I started running again. This time, I wasn't jogging for exercise. I was running to get out. The trail stretched ahead of me, winding between the darkening trees, and all I could think about was getting home. The footsteps, the shadow, they were all behind me now, and yet the feeling of being watched, of something following me, hung thick in the air. And then I saw it again. The shadow, darting between the trees ahead of me this time. It was closer now, too close, and it wasn't a deer or a squirrel or a trick of the light. It was something else. I stopped, my whole body shaking, and stared into the woods. The sun had almost set, and the darkness was creeping in, casting long shadows between the trees. But there was something there, something in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen it. My foot hit something behind me, a rock or a root, and I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell. And that's when I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they weren't behind me. They were in front of me, coming from the shadows. Closer. I turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The footsteps were behind me now, chasing me, closing the distance. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, whatever it was, right behind me, closing in, the space between us shrinking with every step. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Gone. I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. I looked back at the trail, expecting to see something. But it was empty, silent, just the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. I didn't go back the next day, or the day after that. In fact, I haven't been back at all. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just tired or stressed, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me. And every time I think about going back, I feel that same heaviness, that same prickling at the back of my neck. I'm not the superstitious type, but there's something about that trail, something I can't explain. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know what I heard, but I do know this. I'm not going back. And maybe if you ever find yourself on a trail like that, with the shadows growing long and the air feeling heavy, maybe you shouldn't either. If that last story made you uneasy, the next one will make your heart race. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and strange things happening were usually chalked up to a neighbor playing pranks or the wind knocking something over. Life was simple, logical, and anything that seemed unusual could always be explained. So, when I finally saved up enough to move into my own apartment, I wasn't expecting anything more than a quiet place to call home. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an old building downtown. The place had seen better days, but it was affordable and the location was perfect. The day I moved in, I spent the afternoon unpacking, getting my furniture in place, and arranging my things. It was exciting, like a new chapter in my life was finally beginning. I felt free. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I threw myself on the couch, turned on the TV, and let out a satisfied sigh. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to the thick walls of the old building. I liked it. No loud neighbors, no cars honking outside, just peace. But that night, things started feeling off. It began with something small. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I noticed a sudden drop in temperature. My skin prickled, and I could see my breath in the mirror. The heater had been running all day, and I knew it wasn't cold enough outside for the apartment to get this chilly, but I didn't think much of it. Old building, I told myself. Probably just needs some maintenance. I made a mental note to call the landlord the next day and went to bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound, something soft, almost like whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but enough to wake me from my sleep. I sat up in bed, listening, but after a few seconds, it stopped. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I told myself I was probably just dreaming and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the strange coldness from the night before was gone. I shrugged it off as a fluke and went about my day. Work was busy, and by the time I got home that evening, I had almost forgotten about the odd noises. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I felt it again. That sudden, unnatural drop in temperature. The air was heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on the room. I flicked on the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before dying out. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, but quickly brushed it off. Old building, I muttered again, trying to convince myself. I grabbed a spare bulb from the closet and changed the light in the hallway. Problem solved. but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. That night, I was lying on the couch watching TV when I heard it again, the soft whispering, like someone was speaking just below the level of hearing. I muted the TV, straining to listen, but the whispers stopped the moment the room fell silent. My skin crawled, but I tried to shake it off. Probably the pipes, I thought. Old buildings make noise. The days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. Sometimes the lights would flicker. Other times I'd feel cold spots in random parts of the apartment, just for a second, and then they'd be gone. I convinced myself it was all explainable, but deep down, a small part of me was starting to doubt that. Then came the night I'll never forget. It had been a long day at work, and I was dead tired. I crawled into bed around midnight, hoping to get a good night's sleep. Everything was quiet. No flickering lights, no cold spots, no whispering. For the first time in days, I felt relaxed. But just as I was drifting off, I heard a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the living room. My eyes shot open, and I sat up, heart pounding. I lay there for a few seconds, listening, but everything was still. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe something fell off the shelf, I thought. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I peeked into the living room, expecting to see a book or picture frame lying on the floor, but everything was in its place. That's when the TV turned on by itself. I froze. The screen flickered to life, static, filling the room with a low hum. I stared at it, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't touched the remote. It was still on the coffee table, right where I'd left it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The lights flickered once, then twice, and then everything went dead. The TV, the lights, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound the faint buzz of the street lamp outside. And then I saw it, a shadow, standing at the end of the hallway. I couldn't make out any features, but it was there, tall, dark, and unmoving. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't disappear. It just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the figure in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the lights flickered back on. The shadow was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But nothing made sense. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. Something had been there, standing in my hallway, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even go back to bed. I sat on the couch, wide awake, with every light in the apartment turned on. The TV stayed off, the silence heavy and oppressive. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I needed to break my lease. I didn't care about the money, I just needed to get out. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I moved out that same week. It's been months now, and I still think about that night. I still wonder what I saw, if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that something was there, something I can't explain. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, this next story will prove you wrong. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing special. I'd just gotten home from work, and the house was quiet, eerily quiet. My parents were out of town for the week, and my brother Tim had gone out with some friends, leaving me alone to get some work done. I didn't mind being by myself. In fact, I kind of liked it. The solitude was peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea, plopped down at my desk in the living room, and opened my laptop. The tapping of the keys echoed slightly in the quiet space as I settled into my work. It was routine, and my mind was focused, comfortably nestled in the flow of my tasks. Hours passed unnoticed, the house remaining still, save for the occasional groan of the old pipes. By then, it was close to midnight, and I was getting ready to call it a night. That's when my phone rang. The sound startled me. It wasn't often I got calls this late. I glanced at the screen and saw Tim's name flash across it. A little odd, I thought, since he'd mentioned he wouldn't be back until morning. Maybe he needed something, but I wasn't worried. I answered, "Hello?" I At first, there was nothing, just static. I thought maybe the connection was bad, so I repeated, "Tim? Hello?" More static. Then, just barely above the noise, I heard it. My name. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if whoever was speaking was savoring each syllable. Matt. It sounded like my brother's voice, but something was off. There was a strange distortion, like it was being played through an old, broken radio. I froze, my hand tightening around the phone. "Tim?" I said again, a little louder this time, my heart starting to race. The static hummed louder for a moment, crackling and popping in my ear. Then the line went dead. I pulled the phone away and stared at it for a second. What the hell was that? I checked the call history, and sure enough, it was Tim's number. Maybe he'd butt-dialed me, and somehow the call picked up some weird interference? But how had it said my name? Shaking it off, I tried calling him back. After a few rings, it went straight to voicemail. That was strange. Tim always had his phone on him. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:24 a.m. Maybe his phone died, or he was in a loud place and didn't hear it ring. I tried to refocus on my work, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my gut. Something about that voice, about hearing my name like that, left me uneasy. I stood up, deciding to check Tim's room. Maybe he'd forgotten something that might explain the call. His room was upstairs at the end of the hall, the last door on the left. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed. Our house was old, and the sounds it made at night weren't new to me. Still, I felt an odd chill crawling up my spine, like something was watching me. I stopped in front of his door and knocked, just in case. "Tim?" I called softly. No answer. I opened the door. His room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. Everything looked normal. His bed was unmade, clothes strewn across the floor like usual. His desk was cluttered with textbooks and papers, and there, right in the middle of it all, was his phone. I felt my heart skip a beat. Tim's phone was right there, untouched. How could he have called me if his phone was still at home? I picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, but the battery was dead, completely drained. It hadn't been used in hours. A heavy weight settled in my chest. I put the phone down slowly, my mind racing. If Tim's phone was here, who or what had just called me from his number? Suddenly, I heard a soft creak from behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, eyes scanning the hallway outside his room. The door was still open, and the hallway beyond was empty. But I swear, for just a second, I thought I saw a shadow move. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed out of the room, every instinct telling me something wasn't right. I made my way downstairs, trying to stay calm, but the house didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt wrong. I sat back down at my desk, the stillness pressing in on me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was off. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone's behind you, even when you can't see them. For the next hour, I sat there, my mind running in circles. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, watching random videos, but every few minutes I found myself glancing at the door, half expecting to see something. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. My legs felt like lead, but some twisted curiosity, drove me toward the stairs. I crept up, every step heavier than the last. The whispering stopped as I reached the top of the stairs. The house was dead silent again. I turned toward Tim's room, dread settling like a stone in my stomach. His door was open, just like I had left it, but something felt different. The air was colder, thicker somehow, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I hesitated in the doorway, straining to hear anything, but the silence was absolute. I took a step inside, my pulse racing, and that's when I saw it. In the corner, just out of the reach of the dim light spilling in from the hallway, something moved. It was small, barely visible, like a shadow. I froze, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and utterly wrong, it spoke again. "Matt?" I stumbled back, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I ran downstairs, grabbed my keys, and left the house without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. I drove around aimlessly until morning, too afraid to go back home. When I finally did, Tim was there, casually eating breakfast like nothing had happened. He said he had stayed at a friend's house all night. And when I checked his phone, there was no record of any call to me. I've never been able to explain it. If that left you trembling, what comes next will leave you frozen with fear. I grew up in a small, quiet house deep in the countryside. It wasn't anything special, just a little one-story place with a big backyard that stretched out into the open fields. Beyond those fields were thick woods. We didn't have neighbors too close, just a few scattered houses about a mile or so down the road. I liked the peace and quiet of it most of the time, and I was used to being alone. My parents worked late, so after school, I'd come home, make a snack, and spend the evening doing my homework or playing video games. That night started out like any other. I was in my room, lying on my bed, trying to finish an assignment for school. My window faced the backyard, so I could see out into the field and part of the woods. It was getting dark, and the sky had that orange-pink glow as the sun dipped behind the trees. I don't know what made me look up, but I glanced out the window for a second and saw something strange. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone from town. People sometimes wandered around back there, maybe hiking or hunting, but this person didn't move. They just stood there, completely still, facing my house. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it was hard to make out any details in the fading light. All I could see was the outline of a figure, tall, thin, and motionless. I figured they'd move on, maybe head back into the woods, but when I looked back at my homework and then glanced up again, the person was still there, staring. A weird feeling crept over me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just some weirdo who'd gotten lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up from my bed and walked over to the window, pressing my face close to the glass, trying to get a better view. The figure didn't move. It didn't wave or gesture. It just stood there, like a shadow, blending into the trees. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I was probably imagining things. After all, we lived in the middle of nowhere. Who would be standing out there, watching our house in the middle of the night? I sat back down, trying to focus on my homework, but every few minutes, I'd find myself glancing out the window again. And each time, the figure was still there, unmoving, watching. It was starting to freak me out. I pulled the curtains closed, hoping that if I couldn't see them, I'd stop thinking about it. But that only made things worse. Now I couldn't help but imagine what might still be out there, hidden just beyond the curtains. My mind raced with possibilities. What if they were some kind of robber, scoping out the house? Or worse, some crazy person? I grabbed my phone and texted my mom. I didn't want to sound like a baby, so I just asked her when she'd be home. She replied a few minutes later, saying they were running late and wouldn't be back until after midnight. Great. I thought about calling someone, maybe my friend Josh, who lived down the road. But I didn't want to sound like an idiot. What was I supposed to say? Hey, there's a creepy person standing in my backyard. That sounded ridiculous. So I decided to wait it out. Maybe if I ignored it long enough, they'd just go away. Hours passed and I stayed in my room, trying to distract myself with TV and games, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Every once in a while, I'd hear a faint rustling sound, like the wind moving through the trees. But the air was still. I checked my phone again, 10:30 p.m. My parents wouldn't be home for at least another hour. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check if the figure was still there. Slowly, I crept over to the window and pulled the curtain back just a crack. My heart sank. The figure was closer. It was no longer standing at the edge of the woods. Now it was halfway across the field, standing still, just staring at my house. I gasped and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I shut the curtains again, this time yanking them tight, and backed away from the window. I thought about calling the police, but what was I supposed to say? There's someone standing in my backyard? That didn't seem like an emergency. I decided to turn off the lights. Maybe if they couldn't see me, they'd go away. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glow of my phone. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until my parents would be home. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Then I heard it, a knock. Faint, but unmistakable. It came from the back door. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? And why would they come to the back door? The knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced, and I felt my hands start to shake. I didn't want to go to the door. I didn't want to see who or what was out there. But I couldn't just ignore it. Slowly, I crept out of my room and down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped, listening. The house was silent, but I could feel the tension in the air, like someone was watching me. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. I took a deep breath and, against my better judgment, opened the door just a crack. There was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart still racing. The backyard was empty, the field stretching out in front of me, silent and still. The figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I walked back to my room, feeling a little foolish for getting so worked up. But when I passed by the window, I hesitated. I didn't want to look, but something made me glance outside one last time. The figure was standing at the edge of the woods again, watching. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone, locked myself in the bathroom, and called my mom. I tried to keep my voice calm, but she could tell something was wrong. I told her everything, about the figure, the knocking, how it kept getting closer. She told me to stay inside and lock all the doors and windows. They'd be home soon. I sat in the bathroom, heart pounding, waiting for the sound of the car pulling into the driveway. When my parents finally got home, I ran out to meet them. I told my dad about the figure, but when he went outside to check, there was no one there. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The next morning, I went out to the backyard to see for myself. The grass was wet with dew, and I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were faint, but they were there, leading from the woods to the middle of the field, right up to where I had seen the figure standing. Then, they turned around and headed back into the woods. I never found out who or what it was. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think I can still feel those eyes watching me, just beyond the trees. You may think you've heard it all, but the next story will take your fear to a new level. I don't even know where to start with this, but maybe talking about it will help. You ever have those times when something just feels off? Not scary, necessarily, but enough to make your skin crawl. That's where I've been for the past few months, living in a constant state of unease. It all began with a phone call. A normal, everyday thing, right? Except it wasn't. It was a Wednesday night, sometime around 2 a.m. I remember because I'd just woken up for no reason, feeling groggy and disoriented. My phone buzzed on the nightstand beside me. The screen lit up with an unknown number, and I almost didn't pick up. But then, curiosity got the better of me, and I slid my finger across the screen to answer. Hello? No one replied. Not even the typical background noise you'd expect when someone accidentally calls you and doesn't realize it. Just silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a prank call. But at 2 a.m, I waited a few more seconds, saying hello again, but the silence slow, deliberate. Like someone on the other end was doing it on purpose, knowing I could hear them. My heart raced and my hand trembled as I held the phone. I didn't say anything. I just listened. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Deep inhales, long exhales. Whoever it was, whatever it was, they wanted me to know they were there. I hung up without a word, my skin crawling with the kind of fear that clings to you. I couldn't sleep after that. I just lay awake, staring at the shadows on the walls, feeling like someone, something, was watching me. I kept telling myself it was just a prank, that there had to be a logical explanation. But the way my chest tightened every time the phone buzzed made me doubt my own reasoning. I started leaving my phone on silent after that. It didn't help. Even without the sound, I could feel the calls, like a weight pressing down on me at 2 a.m. every night. I'd wake up automatically, checking my phone, and sure enough, there'd be a missed call from the same number. I don't know when it changed exactly, but eventually, the calls stopped coming from an unknown number. Instead, the name on the screen showed up as no caller ID. That's when things started getting worse. One night, I woke up not to the buzz of my phone, but to the sound of my door creaking open. I live alone in a small apartment, and my bedroom door was always closed before I went to bed. I'm obsessive about that kind of thing. So when I saw it slowly swinging open, My stomach dropped. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but the cold air that drifted into the room was too real, too sharp against my skin. I didn't dare move. Maybe they were right. But after that night, after hearing the breathing inside my apartment, I knew it wasn't just a prank. Someone or something was tormenting me. I even considered moving, but the thought of leaving my home because of some sick game felt ridiculous. I thought about going to the police, but what could I tell them? I'm getting creepy phone calls. They'd just shrug and tell me to change my number or block the calls. But I knew changing my number wouldn't stop whatever was happening. I stopped answering the calls entirely. It didn't matter. The calls kept coming, and even though I refused to pick up, I could still feel the weight of it. The presence on the other end, waiting, watching. Then, one night, everything escalated. I woke up at exactly 2 a.m. as usual, but this time my phone wasn't ringing. Instead, it was vibrating on the floor next to my bed. I must have knocked it off the nightstand in my sleep. I picked it up, dreading what I'd see, and sure enough, the screen was lit up with a call. No caller ID. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something stopped me. A voice in the back of my mind telling me I needed to know. I needed to face it. So, against every instinct I had, I answered. The breathing started immediately. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was right there, in the room with me. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a second I thought I might pass out from the fear. Then, over the breathing, I heard a voice. A whisper, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I'm coming for you. That was the last straw. I hung up, threw the phone across the room, and turned on every light in the apartment. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I called my phone company and changed my number. The calls stopped after that, but the fear didn't. Every night at 2 a.m., I still wake up, my heart racing, expecting to hear the buzz of my phone or the sound of breathing from the hallway. I haven't heard the calls since I changed my number, but sometimes I wonder if it's just waiting for the right moment to start again. And every night, I wonder if tonight will be the night. If you thought that was disturbing, brace yourself for the next tale. The door's in the kitchen, tucked away in the corner near the pantry. It creaks open on its own sometimes, but I've always just chalked it up to the house settling. You know, old wood and all that. At first, it wasn't a big deal. Annoying, sure, but nothing sinister. I just get up, close the door, and go about my day. But lately, things have gotten strange. I first noticed something was off about a month ago. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when I heard it creak. That familiar sound of the basement door swinging open. I sighed, already used to the routine. I paused the movie, got up, and walked into the kitchen to close it. As I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden, cold draft coming from the basement. Now that was unusual. The basement was always stuffy, hot even. It didn't make sense that there'd be a cold breeze coming from down there. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but eventually shrugged it off. Probably just some weird air current, right? I pulled the door shut and locked it, just to be safe. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention to the little things. The house didn't feel right that night. There was this heaviness in the air, like the walls were holding their breath. But I ignored it and went back to my movie. The next couple of weeks passed by uneventfully. The door would still open occasionally, but nothing out of the ordinary. Just an old house doing old house things. That is, until last week. I was home alone, as usual, late at night. It was a Friday, and I'd had a long day at work, so I decided to treat myself to a movie night. I made some popcorn, curled up on the couch, and started watching one of those cheesy horror films. You know, the kind where the protagonist does all the dumb things you're not supposed to do, going into dark basements while investigating strange noises. Ironically fitting, now that I think about it. About halfway through the movie, I heard the door again creak. Only this time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone had pushed it open. I froze. My eyes flicked to the kitchen. From where I was sitting, I could just barely see the edge of the doorframe, and sure enough, it was open. I hadn't heard any footsteps, no sign of anyone being in the house, but something about it felt wrong. My heart started to race, and for the first time in years, I felt that old childhood fear creeping up my spine. The fear of the dark, of the unknown. I muted the TV and listened. The house was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood up slowly, my skin prickling with goosebumps, and walked toward the kitchen. My footsteps were loud on the hardwood floor, the sound of my own breathing too harsh in the stillness. When I reached the door, I felt it again, the cold draft. But this time, it was stronger, almost like something was breathing from the basement. The air had a strange weight to it, thick and damp, and it smelled off, like something had been left to rot. I leaned forward, just enough to peer into the darkness beyond the doorframe. The basement light was off, as usual, but there was something else. A sound. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder the longer I stood there. It was a whisper. My name. It wasn't loud, not at all. It was soft, like someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs calling me up. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. There was no mistaking it. I heard my name, clear as day, from the dark depths of the basement. For a moment I stood there, frozen in place, unsure if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That voice, it was real. I slammed the door shut, harder than I meant to, and backed away, my hands trembling. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I fumbled with the lock. I didn't care how irrational it seemed. I wasn't going to leave that door unlocked. Not after what I heard. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, wide awake, every little creak of the house making me jump. I told myself I'd just imagined it, that there was a perfectly logical explanation. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, that whisper lingered in the back of my mind. The next morning, I avoided the kitchen as much as possible. I even considered calling someone to come check it out. A friend, maybe, or even a locksmith to make sure the door stayed shut. But I couldn't bring myself to admit it. I mean, what would I say? Hey, I think my basement's haunted because I heard it whisper my name. Days passed, and I did my best to pretend nothing had happened. I stayed out of the kitchen unless I absolutely had to, and when I did, I made sure to keep my distance from the basement door. But the unease never left me. I started sleeping with the lights on, too afraid to let the darkness in. Then, last night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, just starting to drift off, when I heard it. The creak of the basement door. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, sharp, like someone had thrown the door open. I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to go down there. But But then, from the shadows, I heard it again. That whisper. My name, clearer than ever before. I backed away, slamming the door shut once more, locking it, and this time I dragged the kitchen table in front of it for good measure. I don't know what's down there, and honestly, I don't want to know. I haven't opened the door since. I don't plan to, but every night I still hear it. The creak of the door, the faint whisper of my name calling me down into the darkness. And every night, I lie awake, wondering how much longer I can ignore it. Things are only getting darker from here. The next story will chill you to the core. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I mean, I've watched the occasional horror movie and felt the chills, but that's as far as it went. Until that one night. The night that I still can't shake off, no matter how hard I try. It was around 2 a.m., maybe later, and the house was quiet. You know that stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the world? Yeah, it was like that. I had been sleeping deeply when nature called, and I groggily got out of bed to use the bathroom. I live with my parents. Always have. We've got this old 2-story house, nothing fancy, but it's home. My room is at the far end of the upstairs hallway. The bathroom is right in the middle, and my parents' bedroom is down at the other end. It's one of those houses where every floorboard creaks, and every sound echoes in the silence. I shuffled to the bathroom, barely awake, did my business, and washed my hands. As I stepped out into the hallway, something made me pause. I'm not sure what it was, but I just felt off. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was the darkness, but something wasn't right. I turned to head back to my room when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. I glanced down the hallway toward my parents' room, and there, at the very end of the hall, just outside their door, was a figure. It was dark, but the dim light from the bathroom let me see enough. The figure was just standing there, not moving. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was solid, tall, about the same height as my dad, but something about it felt wrong. My first thought was that it was my dad. Maybe he'd gotten up for a drink of water or something, but he just stood there, frozen. Not a single movement. I called out softly, "Dad?" No answer. Just silence. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. But when I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. The hallway was empty. My heart started racing. I don't know why, but something about that moment terrified me more than anything I had ever experienced. I rushed back to my room, slammed the door, and dove under my covers like a little kid. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making me jump. I must have eventually fallen asleep because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through my window and everything felt normal again, like the night before had been a bad dream. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. At breakfast, I hesitated, but I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Dad, did you get up last night?" He looked at me, confused. "No." "Why?" I didn't want to tell him what I saw. It sounded crazy, but I had to know. "I thought I saw someone standing outside your door." His face paled a little, and he glanced at my mom. "I didn't leave the room last night." That was all he said, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't sure I was imagining things either. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the house. I never saw the figure again, but I could feel it. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes when I walked down the hallway, I'd get this overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, but I never did. I didn't want to see it again. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was just my imagination or something else, but every time I think about it, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach, like it's still there, waiting, and I'll never forget the way it just disappeared. The worst part? I never got an explanation. Maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't my dad. That was just the beginning. Now, prepare yourself for something even more terrifying. I remember that night like it happened yesterday. It started off so normal, so typical, that it feels almost ridiculous now to think of how quickly things took a turn. But isn't that how it always goes? The weird stuff sneaks up on you when you least expect it, and when you're sure you're just living another ordinary day. It was a Wednesday evening. I was home alone, which wasn't all that uncommon. My mom had a late shift at the hospital, and I was used to fending for myself in the evenings. I'd come home from school, finished my homework, and had just started to make dinner. Something simple, pasta, or maybe a grilled cheese. Nothing too elaborate. The kitchen was quiet, aside from the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clinking of utensils as I moved around. The house was calm, just me, the empty rooms upstairs, and the quiet night settling in outside. I had my phone sitting on the counter, playing some random playlist to keep me company. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the fading light outside bathed everything in that soft, dusky glow. And that's when I heard it. "James," my mom's voice called from upstairs. It was muffled, but unmistakable. My name, plain as day, in the exact tone she always used when she needed something. I paused mid-motion, my hand gripping the handle of the pot I was about to put on the stove. My mom wasn't supposed to be home yet. She had texted me just an hour earlier, saying she wouldn't be back until much later. Maybe she came home early? Maybe I hadn't heard her come in? "James," she called again, a little louder this time, but with the same urgency. I frowned, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and called back, "Mom?" No response. I turned off the burner I had just switched on and left the kitchen, heading for the stairs. My mind was running through all the reasonable explanations. Maybe she needed help with something and was in her room. Maybe she had come home feeling sick. But there was this strange feeling creeping into my gut, a tightness I couldn't quite shake. When I got to the top of the stairs, the hallway was dim, the light from my room spilling faintly out into the corridor. My mom's door was closed, which wasn't unusual. Still, I knocked softly. "Mom?" I said again, pressing my ear to the door. Nothing. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Mom, are you in there?" Silence. And then, just when I was about to turn the handle, I heard her voice again. But this time, it wasn't coming from inside her room, it came from downstairs. "James, can you come down here for a second?" she called. My stomach dropped. I had just been downstairs. There was no way she could have moved that fast. The house wasn't that big, and I would have heard her if she passed me on the stairs. Besides, I'd just been standing at the top of them, and the view down was clear. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring back down the staircase into the darkened hallway below. I wanted to believe I was just hearing things, or that maybe my mom had some logical explanation for how she was moving around the house without me noticing. But deep down, I knew something was off. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. Maybe I'd just been imagining things. Maybe I hadn't noticed her come home, and she had been in a different room the whole time. Maybe. But my gut kept screaming that something wasn't right. I walked back down the stairs, slower this time, each step creaking beneath my weight. The kitchen light was still on, casting a warm glow over the countertops. Everything looked normal. The pot I had set out was still there, the ingredients untouched. "Mom?" I called again, this time louder. No answer. The house was too quiet. The playlist I had been playing had stopped, leaving the air thick with a strange kind of stillness. I hesitated, my hand resting on the banister, and that's when I heard the voice again. My mom's voice, this time even closer. "James, come here." It was coming from the kitchen now, or maybe just beyond it, near the back door. My heart was racing at this point, and every hair on my body was standing on end. I couldn't explain it, but something deep inside was screaming at me not to go in there. Whatever was calling me, it wasn't my mom. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. I backed up a step, my eyes darting around the room, looking for something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. But then it came again, that voice. Closer, more insistent. "James," I ran. I bolted out of the kitchen and up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I slammed my bedroom door shut behind me, locking it, and pressed my back against it, gasping for breath. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. For a few minutes I stood there, straining to hear anything from downstairs. The house was quiet again, eerily quiet. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed my mom's number. She picked up after a couple of rings. "Hey James, everything okay?" Her voice was light, casual. She sounded like she was still at work. I swallowed hard. "Mom, are you home?" There was a pause. "No, I told you I'd be home late tonight. Why? Is something wrong?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her what had just happened, but it sounded crazy, even to me. I forced a laugh, trying to sound normal. "No, nothing. I just thought I heard you." She laughed softly on the other end. "Well, I'll be home in a couple of hours, okay? You're all right?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice wavered. "Yeah, I'm good." We hung up, and I sat on my bed, staring at the door. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I didn't dare go back downstairs, didn't even want to open my door. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had called my name, it was still down there, waiting. When my mom finally came home later that night, I didn't tell her what had happened. I couldn't. It felt too strange, too unreal to even try to explain. But I've never forgotten it. And here's the thing. Since that night, every time I'm home alone, I still hear it. Sometimes it's faint, just a whisper of my name. Other times it's clear as day, my mom's voice calling from another room, even though I know I'm the only one in the house. I don't know what it is. I don't think I ever will. But I'll tell you this. I've never been more afraid of my own home than I am now. If that last tale gave you goosebumps, this next one will haunt your nightmares. I moved into the house last summer. It was small and perfect for me, just a simple one-bedroom place on a quiet street. Nothing fancy, but it had charm. The kind of house you could imagine yourself growing old in. It had this old-world feel, with creaky wooden floors and a basement that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. You know, the kind of basement where your breath gets caught for no reason and the air feels just a little too still. But I didn't mind it at first. It was my own little place, and I was thrilled to have a space to call home. The basement, that's where it all started. The first few days went by in a blur of unpacking and settling in. The house was cozy, quiet, maybe too quiet. One night, while putting away some old boxes in the basement, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper, a soft, almost unintelligible murmur, as if someone was talking just behind me. At first, I thought it was the pipes. The house was old, after all, and old houses make noises. But this felt different. It didn't make sense, though. There was no one else here. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, or maybe my imagination running wild from being in an unfamiliar place. Still, something about the sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't spend much time in the basement after that. I would run down quickly if I needed something, always with a feeling that I wasn't alone. You ever get that sensation that someone is standing right behind you? Yeah, it was like that, every single time. But it wasn't until a few weeks later that things started to get worse. One night, I was sitting on the couch, half watching a movie, half dozing off, when I heard it again. That same faint whisper. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the basement, it was upstairs, just above me. I paused the movie and listened, heart racing. The whispering was so soft, but it felt deliberate, like it was trying to tell me something. I stood up slowly, my body on autopilot, and started walking toward the stairs. My mind was screaming at me not to go up there, but my legs had a mind of their own. As I climbed the steps, the whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out what it was saying. It was like it was just out of reach, just quiet enough to keep me guessing. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I reached the top of the stairs. I checked each room, one by one, but they were all empty, no sign of anything or anyone. But the whispering didn't stop. It was everywhere now, filling the house, wrapping around me like a fog. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the walls were closing in on me. I rushed back downstairs. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear them, soft, insistent, like a voice just on the edge of my consciousness. And it wasn't just at night. I started hearing them during the day, too. Sometimes it was just a word or two. Sometimes it was a full sentence. But no matter how hard I tried to listen, I could never quite make out what they were saying. It was maddening. I stopped going into the basement completely. In fact, I avoided that part of the house altogether. I couldn't explain it, but I just knew that whatever was causing those whispers, it started down there. Weeks passed, and the whispers became more frequent. I started feeling like I was being watched, like there was someone or something in the house with me. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was never anyone, just the whispers. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. The whispers were louder down there, almost overwhelming. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air was being sucked out of the room. I shone the flashlight around, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep the beam steady. The basement looked the same as it always did, old, musty, full of cobwebs. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a small wooden door in the corner, half hidden behind some boxes. I don't know how I missed it all this time, but there it was. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct in my body screaming at me not to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. That's when the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the whispers. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Go in? Run back upstairs? Call someone? But before I could decide, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. The feeling of someone standing right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there, just the empty basement. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling, and ran upstairs without looking back. I haven't gone back down to the basement since that night. The door to the corridor is still down there, waiting. The whispers haven't stopped, but they're quieter now, more distant, like they're waiting for something, or someone. I don't know what's in that corridor, and I don't want to know. All I know is that this house isn't what it seems. Something is here, something I can't explain, and it's watching me. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the whispers. They're soft, just on the edge of hearing. But every now and then, I catch a word, a phrase, and it's always the same. Come back. But I won't. I can't. Not after what I felt that night. Not after the cold breath on my neck. Not after realizing that whatever is whispering, it's not human, and it's waiting for me to open that door again. The house is quiet now, but it's a different kind of quiet. A silence filled with anticipation. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Every night, the whispers get a little louder, a little clearer, and I'm starting to understand them. Starting to hear what they've been trying to tell me all along. But I don't want to listen. I just want to be left alone. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if it ever will. But if you're reading this, just remember one thing. If you ever move into an old house with a creepy basement, don't open the door. No matter what you hear. You think that was bad? The next story will make your skin crawl. I've lived in this house my entire life. It's one of those old, two-story houses in a quiet, small town. Nothing special. Just your typical place where everyone knows everyone. I never really thought much about the house. It creaks at night, the floors are uneven in places, and the windows stick. But that's just how old houses are, right? I share the place with my mom and dad, but they work a lot. I'm often alone in the evenings, especially during the school year. I'm a pretty easygoing person, so I never got spooked being home by myself. At least, not until this started happening. My room's on the second floor, and there's this old window on the far wall, right by my bed. It's a big window, probably too big, and the frame is ancient. You have to really push to get it to shut all the way. Sometimes I'd even have to give it a couple of tries to get the latch to click. But once it's locked, it's locked. At least, that's what I thought. It started small. One night, I woke up and the window was wide open. I could feel the cold breeze against my face, and my heart dropped. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. Maybe I hadn't. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd just forgotten. We all forget things when we're tired, right? But the next night, the same thing happened. I woke up to find the window wide open again, cold air rushing in and making my curtains billow out like ghosts. I knew for a fact I'd locked it that time. I remembered struggling with the latch before finally hearing it click shut. I had even double-checked before turning off the lights. Still, I tried to be rational about it. Maybe the latch was old and loose. Maybe it wasn't as secure as I thought. So the next day, I took a closer look. The latch seemed fine, maybe a little rusty, but it worked. I even gave the window a few good tugs after locking it, and it didn't budge. That should have made me feel better, but for some reason, it didn't. The night after that, I stayed up a little later than usual. I had a test the next day, and I was cramming. By the time I finally got into bed, I was exhausted. I remember laying there, staring at the window, almost daring it to open. But nothing happened. It stayed shut, just like it should. I must have drifted off, but I don't remember falling asleep. What I do remember is waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. It was that strange kind of waking where you don't know what pulled you out of sleep, but you're instantly alert. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it, that cold breeze again. My eyes snapped to the window, and my stomach sank. It was slowly creaking open. I just lay there, frozen, watching as the window inched open, bit by bit, until there was a gap big enough for something to slip through. The night air poured in, carrying with it the soft rustle of the trees outside. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling. You know that sensation when you just know you're being watched? That prickly, crawling feeling on the back of your neck? It was like that, but more intense. I could feel eyes on me. Not just from outside, but from inside my room. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My gaze darted toward the corner of the room, the darkest part, where the shadows seemed to shift and move. For a second, I thought I saw something there. A shape, tall, thin, watching me. But then it was gone, as if it had never been there. I threw myself out of bed and slammed the window shut, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the latch. I pressed down on it until I heard the click, then I backed away, breathing hard, staring at the window like it might open again at any second. It didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, my back against the wall, facing the window, waiting for it to open again. But it stayed shut. When the sun finally came up, I felt ridiculous. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just imagining things. But it kept happening. Every night, I'd wake up and the window would be open. Sometimes I'd catch it in the act, slowly creaking open like it had a mind of its own. Other times, it would already be wide open, and that cold, heavy feeling of being watched would settle over me like a blanket. I tried telling my parents, but they just laughed it off. "It's an old house," they said. "Things creak, windows stick. It's nothing to worry about." But I knew it wasn't normal. There was something wrong with that window. Something unnatural. One night, I even nailed the window shut. I used 3 big nails, hammered them into the frame as hard as I could. I thought for sure that would solve the problem. But that night, when I woke up, the nails were still there, and the window was wide open. That was the last straw. I moved my bed to the other side of the room, as far from the window as possible. I started sleeping with the lights on too, even though it didn't help much. Every night, I still felt that presence, those eyes watching me from the darkness outside, or maybe from inside my room. It's been weeks now, and the window still opens on its own every single night. I've stopped trying to close it. What's the point? No matter what I do, it'll just open again. But now, I never sleep facing the window. I can't. I'm too scared of what I might see if I do. Because I know, deep down, that whatever's out there isn't just watching anymore. It's waiting. And one day, it's going to come in. That was just the beginning. Now things are about to get much darker. I've always loved driving. It's my thinking space. The rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, it gives me time to clear my head, especially after a long day at work. I never used to mind the late shifts, and I took comfort in the routine of the drive home. My route never changed. It was about an hour of back roads that I knew like the back of my hand. The familiarity was comforting, almost automatic. I could drive it in my sleep, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday night, nothing unusual. I'd stayed late at the office to finish up a report, which meant I'd be heading home well after dark. My boss had already left, and I was the last one in the building, turning off lights and locking up. As I pulled out of the parking lot, the night air was thick and still, like the kind of silence that presses on your ears. It felt heavier than usual, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I merged onto the back roads, knowing that within an hour I'd be home, sipping a cup of tea and winding down. The road was deserted, just the way I liked it. No distractions, no other cars, just me and the stretch of asphalt under my tires. I zoned out a bit, as I often did. You know that feeling when you drive the same route so often that you don't even think about it? I let my mind wander, thinking about the day, about what I'd do tomorrow. It was the same routine. The radio played softly, some talk show I wasn't really paying attention to. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, and the occasional streetlight flickered by. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. I blinked and realized I didn't recognize where I was. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I glanced at the road signs. Nothing seemed familiar. No landmarks, no signs of life, just an empty road cutting through the woods. I'd driven this route hundreds of times. How could I not recognize it? I had to have just missed something, I thought. Maybe I zoned out a bit longer than usual. I quickly grabbed my phone, checking the GPS. The blue dot was still on my usual route, so logically, I was right where I should be. But nothing about the road seemed right. There weren't any houses, no intersections, no turns that I remembered. Just a long, winding stretch of road that seemed to stretch out endlessly into the dark. That's when the feeling hit me. It wasn't fear, not yet, but an overwhelming sense of disorientation. Like I had slipped into some parallel version of my route, where everything looked the same but was off. I couldn't place it exactly, but it was there, lingering in the back of my mind. I thought maybe I just needed to focus, pay closer attention. I drove on, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was later than I thought. Much later. Almost an hour had passed since I left work, but I should have been close to home by now. My GPS still showed me on the right path, but none of it made sense. I couldn't remember the last 30 minutes. I had no memory of the drive, no recollection of passing through any familiar areas. My heart started to race. I slowed the car down, squinting at the road ahead. It was pitch black, no streetlights, no headlights coming the other way, just me and the darkness. My breath quickened, and I tried to shake off the rising panic. It's just fatigue, I told myself. You're tired, you're imagining things. But it didn't feel like that. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to get my bearings. I needed to get a grip, figure out where I was. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate, swallowing me whole. Even the faint hum of the radio was gone. I sat there for a moment, my fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like something was pressing in around me. I checked my phone again. The GPS still said I was on the right road. I zoomed in on the map, trying to see if there was anything nearby, anything that would give me some clue as to where I was. But it was just empty. A long, empty road surrounded by nothing but woods. I leaned back in my seat, taking a deep breath. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant tapping. At first I thought it was coming from the car, like maybe something had shifted in the engine or the wind was rustling the trees. But the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It wasn't the car. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the woods beside the road. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were steady, moving closer. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew something was out there. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled to restart the car. My fingers shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, but those footsteps kept coming. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the side of the road. I didn't dare look back. I just drove faster than I ever had before, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know how long I drove before I finally saw something familiar. A gas station, dimly lit in the distance. Relief washed over me, and I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still trembling. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't know what I heard, or why I couldn't remember that stretch of the drive. I don't know why the GPS said I was where I should have been, even though nothing looked right. I never saw anything, never got a clear answer to what was out there. But something was. And now, whenever I drive home late, I take a different route, just in case. If that sent a chill down your spine, brace yourself for what's next. I've never really considered myself the type to scare easily. I'm the kind of guy who shrugs off horror movies, chalks up creepy noises to the house settling, and laughs at ghost stories. My wife, on the other hand, jumps at the smallest things, a creak in the floor, a shadow out of the corner of her eye. And I've always reassured her that it's nothing. But I've got to admit, lately, I'm starting to question everything. We live in a pretty normal house, on a quiet street, in a small suburban neighborhood. You know the kind of place. Tree-lined streets, kids riding their bikes, neighbors waving hello as they water their lawns. Nothing extraordinary ever happens here. Which is why, when strange things started happening, I didn't think much of it at first. It all began when we set up the baby monitor for our daughter, Sophie. She's only 2, and we keep a monitor in her room just in case she wakes up during the night. The thing picks up every little noise, her soft breathing, the rustle of her blanket, the creak of the floor if she moves. It's always been comforting to know we can hear everything, but now I'm not so sure. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft noise coming from the monitor. I was groggy, and at first I thought it was just Sophie stirring in her sleep. But the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't the usual rustling or quiet whimpering. It was talking, muffled, like someone was whispering in the room. I figured it was my wife, maybe checking on Sophie, so I rolled over to go back to sleep. But then I noticed something strange. My wife was still lying next to me, fast asleep. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding. The whispering continued, barely audible, but definitely there. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a man's voice, soft and low, almost like a conversation. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the monitor was picking up some kind of interference, like a neighbor's radio or something. That had to be it, right? Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. I got out of bed, trying to stay quiet so I wouldn't wake my wife, and made my way to Sophie's room. The door was cracked open just enough for me to peek inside. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of her nightlight. I could see her in her crib, sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. But the whispering, it was still there. I stepped into the room, every nerve on edge, and moved toward the monitor. The voice seemed to fade, growing quieter the closer I got, until eventually it stopped altogether. I stared at the monitor, my mind racing. It was silent now, just the gentle hum of white noise. I glanced around the room, checking every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing, no one. Just me, Sophie, and the unnerving stillness of the night. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just interference, just a technical glitch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, kept listening for any sound, any hint of that voice again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd been half asleep, dreaming, and it felt real. That had to be it. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I woke up immediately when I heard the whispering. It was louder, clearer, though still muffled, like someone was talking from just out of earshot. I didn't even try to rationalize it this time. I grabbed the monitor and stared at it, hoping to see some kind of explanation, some glitch, something that would make this make sense. But all I saw was the familiar image of Sophie's room, dark and quiet, her little form barely visible under the blanket. And the voice, it just kept going, talking, murmuring, like someone was standing right there in her room. I rushed to Sophie's room again, my heart pounding in my chest. Just like before, the whispering stopped the moment I stepped inside. Everything was quiet. I checked the entire house that night. Every room, every closet, even the attic. But there was no one else here. Just my wife, my daughter, and me, alone. The days went on, and the whispering became a regular occurrence. It would start at random times in the night, sometimes soft, sometimes louder, but always unsettling. I thought about telling my wife, but I didn't want to scare her. Besides, what would I even say? That the baby monitor was picking up a voice, but there was no one there? She'd think I was losing it. I tried everything to explain it, turning off all the electronics in the house, replacing the monitor, even checking with the neighbors to see if they were using any devices that could be causing interference. Nothing worked. The voice never went away. It was always there, in the background, whispering, murmuring, but never loud enough to understand. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my phone next to the monitor and hit record as soon as the whispering started. I listened to the recording the next morning, hoping to catch something, anything that would make sense of this. But when I played it back, all I heard was static. No voice, no whispering, just white noise. That's when I realized whatever this was, it wasn't something I could explain, and it wasn't going away. Now, every night I lie awake waiting for the whispering to start. I've tried turning the monitor off, but I can't. What if Sophie needs us and we don't hear her? What if something happens? But at the same time, I dread the moment the voice begins again, soft and low, like someone is right there in her room, talking to her. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm imagining it, if there's really something or someone in the house with us. But whatever it is, it's not going away. And the worst part is, I don't think I'll ever know what it is. Now, every night, I just wait for the voice, and hope it never gets any closer. You thought you could catch your breath? Not for long. The next story is even more haunting. I've always been the kind of person who loved old things, stuff with history, character. It wasn't surprising then that when my grandma passed away and left me this old, ornate mirror, I was more excited than creeped out. It had been in the family for generations, tucked away in various attics, forgotten behind bedroom doors, and finally it found its way into my apartment. It was beautiful, really. Tall, with a frame carved from some dark wood, aged but polished to a soft glow. Intricate designs of leaves and flowers curled around. For a while, the mirror was just that, a mirror. It stood in my bedroom, leaning against the wall opposite the bed, where I'd see myself every morning and night. No big deal. I'd use it to check my outfits, fix my hair, and occasionally I'd even admire the craftsmanship. You don't see things like this anymore. But then slowly, things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things. You know how sometimes you walk by a mirror and think you see something out of the corner of your eye? Something that makes you do a double take? That started happening more and more with this mirror. I'd walk past, and for a split second, I'd swear my reflection wasn't quite right. Like my reflection was a second too slow, or maybe moved in a slightly different way than I had. But I'd shake it off, figured it was just my imagination, or maybe I was tired. Then one night, I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, and the weirdest thing happened. I stood there, minding my own business, when I caught something strange in the mirror. At first, it looked like my reflection, but it wasn't moving with me. My hand had stopped, toothbrush in midair, but the reflection, it was still brushing its teeth. I froze, staring at it, heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was a delay, or maybe a glitch, like a lag in a video. My reflection eventually caught up, moving normally again, but by then, I was already freaked out. I quickly finished brushing and backed out of the bathroom, refusing to look directly at the mirror. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the mirror behind me, like it was watching. I know it sounds crazy, but there was this heavy feeling like I wasn't alone in the room. The next morning, I decided to move the mirror. I told myself it was just temporary, that maybe it was reflecting the light weirdly or something. So I dragged it out of my room and down the hall to the guest bedroom, where I didn't have to see it every day. Out of sight, out of mind, right? For a while it helped. The strange feeling lessened, and I started to forget about it. I'd go about my days as normal, and life moved on. But then, little things started happening around the apartment. It began with noises. Late at night, I'd hear soft tapping sounds, like someone knocking gently on a door. But when I got up to check, nothing. Just silence. Then, doors would be open when I knew I'd closed them, and lights would flicker, even though I'd just replaced the bulbs. I told myself it was the house settling, maybe a draft, but deep down, I didn't believe that. I was too scared to go check. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, until morning light finally crept through the curtains. That's when I noticed something. When I passed the guest bedroom door on the way to the bathroom, it was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. The mirror had been in there for weeks, and I'd kept the door closed. But now, it was open just a crack, enough that I could see the edge of the mirror through the gap. My stomach turned. I was done. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, jumping at every little sound. I decided to get rid of the mirror. Maybe donate it, maybe just throw it out. I didn't care. I just wanted it out of my house. That evening, I called a friend to help me move it. As we were getting ready to haul it out, I caught one last look at it, and for a split second I swear the reflection wasn't me. It was almost like someone else was standing there, staring back at me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned away, refusing to look again. We got the mirror out of the apartment, and I left it by the curb, hoping someone would take it. I didn't care where it went, as long as it was gone. Since then, things have calmed down. The strange noises have stopped, and I don't feel like I'm being watched anymore. But every now and then, I'll catch myself thinking about that mirror, wondering where it ended up. Sometimes, I can't help but imagine someone else picking it up, bringing it home, and experiencing the same thing. Maybe they'll see what I saw. Maybe they'll dismiss it, like I did at first. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never look at another old mirror the same way again. The mystery of that mirror still haunts me. Did I imagine it all? Was there really something wrong with it? I'll never know. But whatever it was, it's not something I ever want to face again. If you weren't scared before, the next tale will change that. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house. They lived in a quiet, old house at the end of a long, tree-lined street. There was nothing special about the house at first glance, just a typical old family home. But there was one thing that always seemed strange to me. There was this room upstairs that was always locked. I never asked them why. It just became one of those things you don't question. Maybe it was a guest room, or maybe they just kept stuff in there they didn't want anyone touching. As a kid, I didn't give it much thought. There were so many other things to do in that house, playing in the yard, reading comics, or sneaking cookies from the kitchen while my grandma wasn't looking. But every now and then, I'd catch myself staring at that door, wondering what was behind it. It was a simple wooden door, painted white like the rest of the house. There was nothing particularly creepy about it. But knowing it was always locked made it feel different. Like it held a secret I wasn't supposed to know. It was the kind of locked door that made my imagination run wild. What if there was something inside that room? Something they were hiding. One summer, I stayed at their house for a week while my parents were out of town. I must have been about 12 at the time. It was the kind of visit that was both fun and a little boring. My grandparents were lovely people, but they weren't exactly adventurous. My grandpa spent most of his time in the garden, and my grandma was always knitting or watching her shows. At night, after dinner, we'd sit in the living room watching TV until it was time for bed. The days were quiet, but at night, the house seemed to change. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. The creaking of the wooden floors, the occasional distant knock that I figured was the wind, and the odd sensation that the house seemed to breathe with its own kind of life when the lights went out. It was an old house, after all. Creaky floorboards and strange noises were just part of the package. But on the third night, something happened. I woke up suddenly, though I didn't know why at first. I lay there, blinking in the darkness, trying to shake off the grogginess that comes with waking up in the middle of the night. Everything was still. The air was heavy and quiet, the way it gets in those deep hours when the rest of the world is asleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps right outside my door. At first I thought maybe it was my grandpa. He sometimes got up in the night to use the bathroom, but the more I listened, the more I realized these footsteps were different. They didn't sound like the shuffle of my grandpa's slippers or the soft padding of my grandma's feet. They were heavier, deliberate, almost like someone trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to pound in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I stared at the handle, half expecting it to turn, but it didn't. Instead, the footsteps continued, moving down the hallway toward the locked room. I don't know why, but I threw off the covers and got out of bed. My feet hit the cold wooden floor, and I stood there for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped, and the house was silent again. But something made me move. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the need to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. Whatever it was, I opened my bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I looked down the hallway toward the locked room, and my heart dropped. The door was open. It shouldn't have been. I knew that. I had passed that door 100 times, and it had always been locked. But now it was wide open, like it had been waiting for me. I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness beyond the door. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was watching me. I didn't know what I expected to see. A shadow, a figure, something. But there was only darkness. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like forever, my feet glued to the floor, my mind racing with every possible explanation. Maybe one of my grandparents had opened it for some reason, though that didn't make sense. They never went into that room. I had never seen them even touch the door. Finally, I snapped out of it. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old house with creaky floors and weird drafts. Maybe the lock was broken, and it had somehow swung open on its own. That had to be it. I turned around and went back to my room, but I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house, waiting for the footsteps to come back. They didn't. The next morning, I went downstairs for breakfast, trying to act normal, even though I could feel the unease sitting heavy in my chest. I didn't mention the door to my grandparents. I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding crazy. But after breakfast, when they were both outside in the garden, I went back upstairs to check. The door was locked again. I stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out what had happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Maybe I had just dreamed it. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that room. I thought about trying the handle, seeing if it would open, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The rest of the week passed without incident. But every night, as I lay in bed, I listened for the footsteps. I never heard them again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had opened that door was still there, just waiting. I didn't stay at my grandparents' house much after that. When I did visit, I always avoided the upstairs hallway, and I never asked them about the room. It felt like a secret, better left untouched. Years later, after my grandparents had passed away and the house was being sold, I had the chance to go back. I was older then, braver, or at least I thought I was. Part of me wanted to finally open that door, to see what had been behind it all those years. But when I got there, the door was gone. The entire room had been sealed off, as if it had never existed. And that's when I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to know what had really been inside. The nightmare doesn't end there. This next story will make sure of that. You know how sometimes you find something strange, but you brush it off, thinking it's nothing? That's what I did at first. I never thought it would spiral into what it became. But I guess you never really know when something is going to change your life. When a seemingly small event will haunt you, clawing at your mind until you can't escape it. It started on a regular Tuesday. I was home alone, which wasn't unusual. My partner was out of town for work, and I'd taken the day off from my own job to do some long overdue cleaning. You know, the kind of cleaning where you actually pull out the junk from old drawers and finally sort through it all. I'd been avoiding it for months, but it was time. I was going through the drawers of my old desk, the one I'd had since high school. It's this heavy wooden thing, kind of beaten up now, but still sturdy. I'd stopped using it a while ago and shoved it into the corner of the spare room. It was more of a storage spot for old papers, notebooks, and random junk I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I was almost done when I reached the bottom drawer, the one I hadn't opened in probably years. It was full of dusty notebooks, some old receipts, and a few pens that had long since dried up. I was sorting through it when my hand brushed against something. It was crumpled, like a ball of paper shoved into the back of the drawer. I pulled it out, half expecting it to be a grocery list or something equally unimportant. But it wasn't. It was a note. I unfolded it, smoothing out the creases, and stared at it for a few seconds. The handwriting was mine. There was no doubt about that. The letters were slightly slanted, just like the way I write. But the message? That's what froze me. It said, "You're not alone." At first, I laughed a little. It seemed like something I would have written as a joke. Maybe I had scribbled it down during a late-night study session back in school, or maybe I'd been messing around with a friend and stuck it in there. But the more I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. I didn't remember writing it. And the ink? It wasn't old and faded like you'd expect from a note that had been stuffed in a drawer for years. It was crisp, fresh, as if it had been written recently. A chill ran down my spine. But I shook it off. It had to be a joke, right? I must have written it at some point and just forgotten. I crumpled the note up and tossed it in the trash, deciding not to think about it anymore. But that night, as I sat on the couch watching TV, I couldn't shake the weird feeling in the back of my mind. It was quiet in the house, too quiet. Usually, I found the silence comforting, but that night it felt different. Heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A faint knock. It was so soft that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I muted the TV and sat up straight, my heart starting to race. The knocks were coming from the front door. I checked the time, 9:45 p.m. Who would be knocking at this time? I stood up, my feet feeling like lead as I walked to the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about this didn't feel right. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a neighbor, or maybe someone had the wrong house. I opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside, peering into the dark street. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. Just the empty street and the cold wind brushing against my skin. I went back inside, closing the door and locking it behind me. But as I turned around, I froze. There was a note on the floor. The same note I'd found in the drawer. "You're not alone." I knew I'd thrown it away. I'd crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash earlier that day. But here it was again, lying on the floor right by the door, perfectly smooth, as if it had never been crumpled at all. I felt sick to my stomach. I grabbed the note, crumpled it up again, and threw it into the trash for the second time, slamming the lid shut. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just some weird prank. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the house settling, the wind outside, even the sound of my own breathing. I kept feeling like someone was watching me, like there were eyes on me even when I was alone in the room. I checked the front door at least 5 times, making sure it was locked, but I still couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling groggy and unsettled. I made myself some coffee and tried to convince myself it had all been in my head. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. Maybe I had just imagined everything. But when I went to take out the trash, the note was gone. It wasn't in the bin. I dug through the garbage, pulling out crumpled papers and empty wrappers, but the note was nowhere to be found. That's when the knocking started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. I didn't answer it. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. The knocking stopped after a minute, but I could feel the tension in the air, like something was waiting. I stayed in the house all day, too afraid to leave. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly, but the fear was there, gnawing at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. And then, just before sunset, I saw it. A figure. Standing at the end of my driveway. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could tell it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and unsettling, like a pressure on my chest. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night either. The days blurred together after that. The knocking continued, always at random times, always when I was alone. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of that figure, always at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to focus on it. And the note kept reappearing. No matter how many times I threw it away, it would always come back, lying there on the floor or on my desk, mocking me with those 3 words, "You're not alone." I don't know how to explain what happened, or why it's happening. All I know is that it won't stop. The knocking, the figure, the note, they're all still here. They won't leave. And I don't think I'm alone anymore. I think they're waiting for me to let them in. If you thought that was the worst of it, think again. What comes next is truly horrifying. I walk the same route to work every morning, a routine I've been following for over 3 years. There's something comforting about routines, you know? Familiarity and knowing exactly where you'll be and when. My walk starts with me leaving my small apartment, turning left past a bakery that always smells like fresh bread, then heading straight for a few blocks before crossing the park. My favorite part is the silence. There's no one else around at that time. The world is still asleep, and it's just me, the cool air, and my thoughts. The first few months, nothing unusual happened. It was always the same, a peaceful walk. But one day, I noticed an old bus stop on my route that I had never really paid attention to before. The sign was rusted, and the bench beneath it looked it had seen better days. No one ever used it, which made sense, given how early it was. I don't think the buses even ran that early. So you can imagine my surprise when, about a month ago, I saw someone standing there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a person waiting for a bus, I thought. They were dressed in a long, heavy coat, despite the weather being pretty mild. Odd, but whatever. People wear what they want, right? The next morning, they were there again. And the next. Always standing in the exact same spot, never sitting on the bench, always staring straight ahead, as if waiting for something. But what? I started to get curious, maybe a little paranoid. Why were they there every morning, at the same time? It didn't make sense. The buses don't run that early, and even if they did, why would anyone stand there in the same spot, day after day, without moving or acknowledging anything around them? I tried to brush it off. I figured it was just someone with a strange routine, like me. But it started getting weirder. After about 2 weeks of passing by this person every morning, I noticed something unsettling. They were always wearing the same coat. It wasn't just the coat, though. It was their posture, their stance, always the same, like they were frozen in time. I told myself it was a coincidence, Maybe I just didn't notice small changes. But the more I passed them, the more I realized that nothing changed. Not their clothes, not their position, not even the way they stood there, staring ahead. It started to bother me. I'm not usually someone who gets freaked out easily, but there was something about this person that made me feel uneasy. It was like they didn't belong. They didn't fit into the rhythm of my routine, of the world around them. I thought about taking a different route, but that would add extra time to my walk. Plus, why should I have to change my routine just because of some stranger? One morning, about 3 weeks into this weirdness, I decided to get a closer look. I don't know what came over me, but I just needed to see if there was something I was missing. As I approached the bus stop, my heart started racing. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just some person waiting for a bus. But as I got closer, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The figure, whoever they were, wasn't standing. They were hovering. It was subtle, but their feet weren't touching the ground. They were just barely off the pavement, like they were suspended in midair. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I stared for what felt like minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, without thinking, I turned and walked away as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. After that, I avoided looking at the bus stop altogether. I kept my head down and walked quickly past it every morning. I didn't want to see that figure anymore. I didn't want to know if they were still there. But every morning, I could feel them. I knew they were there, even without looking. The air felt heavier when I passed that spot, like something was watching me, waiting for me to notice them again. Then, about a week ago, something changed. I woke up late, rushed through my usual routine, and bolted out the door, trying to make up for lost time. I was halfway through my walk when I realized I hadn't passed the bus stop yet. I was confused. It should have been behind me by now. But as I looked ahead, there it was. The same rusty sign, the same broken bench, and standing in front of it, in the exact same spot, was the figure. Only this time, they weren't just standing there. They were facing me. I froze. My blood ran cold as I realized that for the first time since I had started seeing them, they had moved. They were looking directly at me. I couldn't see their face. It was obscured by the shadow of their hood, but I knew they were staring at me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep walking, my eyes locked on the ground in front of me. I didn't dare look up again. When I got to work, I was shaking. I couldn't focus on anything. All I could think about was that figure and how they had turned to face me. What did they want? Why were they there? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone messing with me, someone who knew my routine and wanted to freak me out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something unnatural about that figure, something I couldn't explain. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that figure standing outside, staring in at me. The next morning, I debated whether to take a different route, but I didn't want to let my fear control me. So I walked the same way, past the same bus stop. When I got there, the figure was gone. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe they were finally gone. But as I walked past the empty bus stop, I felt a presence behind me, like someone was following me. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel them getting closer, their footsteps echoing mine. But when I reached the end of the street and glanced back, there was no one there. That was a few days ago. Now, I don't know what to do. Every morning, I feel like I'm being followed. Like that figure is still out there, watching me, waiting for me to notice them again. I haven't told anyone about it because, honestly, who would believe me? It sounds crazy, but I know what I saw, and I know that whatever that figure is, it's not normal. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. The fear is eating away at me, and every time I pass that bus stop, I feel like I'm tempting fate. I don't know what will happen if I stop, if I look back, if I acknowledge them again. But part of me is terrified to find out, so for now, I just keep walking. Still with me? Good, because the next story will push your fear to its limits. I remember the day it all started. It was just a regular Wednesday, the kind of day that's so ordinary you don't even think twice about it. I had finished work, grabbed a quick dinner from the local takeout place, and was walking home. I live in a quiet neighborhood, a mix of old houses and newer modern builds, nothing too flashy. The kind of place where people nod and smile at you on the sidewalk. There's a house on the corner of my block, a small, beige two-story with a white picket fence. My neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, lives there with his dog, Max. Now, Max is the kind of dog that would bark at anything, a squirrel, a passing car, even a leaf blowing across the street. I've always found it a bit annoying, but you get used to it after a while. That's just Max, the noisy little watchdog of the neighborhood. But that Wednesday was different. As I walked past Mr. Jenkins' house, I noticed something odd. Max didn't bark. He didn't even make a sound. Instead, he was sitting perfectly still in the yard, just staring at me. His eyes were wide, and his body was rigid, almost like he was frozen in place. It struck me as strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just tired or had finally gotten used to seeing me around. I kept walking, but as I passed by the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Max trotting after me, or maybe even barking at some other passerby. But no, he was still there, sitting perfectly still, eyes locked on me, or rather, behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing, just the empty street, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the fading light of the setting sun. I laughed at myself, feeling ridiculous. It was probably nothing, just a weird coincidence. But the next day, it happened again. I was walking home, the same route as always, and there was Max, sitting in the yard, staring at me with those wide eyes. This time, it unnerved me more. His gaze wasn't on me. It was past me, over my shoulder, as if something or someone was standing right behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned around. But once again, nothing. The street was completely empty. No cars, no people, just silence. I shook my head and kept walking, quickening my pace. I didn't know why, but it bothered me. It bothered me more than it should have. Over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. Every time I walked past Mr. Jenkins's house, Max would sit in the yard, staring at me, or behind me, and every time I'd feel this strange, creeping sense of unease. I started avoiding the house, crossing the street whenever I reached the corner. It felt silly, but I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to feel that weird sense of being watched by something I couldn't see. One night, I was coming home late after a long day at work. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so. I had been working overtime on a project, and by the time I left the office, it was well past midnight. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the strange feeling that had been gnawing at me for days. As I reached the corner of the block, I saw Max again, but this time, he wasn't in the yard. He was standing at the edge of the street, right by the fence, staring at me. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, but he wasn't barking, he wasn't moving. Just standing there, frozen, his gaze fixed on something behind me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I stopped walking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see, I don't know what. A person, an animal, something. But again, there was nothing. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear that had taken hold of me. "You're losing it," I muttered to myself. "It's just a dog, there's nothing there." But Max didn't move. He just kept staring, his body tense, his eyes wide with what looked like fear. Real, palpable fear. I didn't know what to do, so I turned around and started walking again. Faster this time. I could feel my heart racing, my hands trembling as I clutched my keys. I was nearly running by the time I reached my house, fumbling to unlock the door. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, but it felt deafening in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise, the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, made me jump. I kept thinking about Max, about the way he had stared at me, or rather, behind me. It was unsettling, to say the least. The next morning, I decided to talk to Mr. Jenkins. I had never really spoken to him much before, just the occasional hello or small talk about the weather, but I figured he might know what was going on with Max. Maybe the dog was sick or had developed some sort of strange behavior. When I knocked on his door, it took a while for him to answer. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and there were deep bags under them. "Hey, sorry to bother you," I started awkwardly. "I just wanted to ask about Max. He's been acting a little strange lately." Mr. Jenkins' face fell, and he let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I know," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's been like that for a few weeks now. Just stares at nothing, doesn't bark anymore. I've taken him to the vet, but they couldn't find anything wrong with him." "Has he always done that?" I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "No, it started out of the blue. One day, he just stopped barking. Now he just sits there, staring at the same spot. It's like he's watching something, but I don't know what." I nodded, not sure what to say. "Well, thanks for letting me know. I hope he gets better soon." Mr. Jenkins gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, me too." I left his house feeling even more unsettled than before. What could make a dog act like that? Why would he just sit there, staring at nothing, or worse, staring at something that only he could see? Days passed, and I continued to avoid walking past Mr. Jenkins' house. The strange feeling of being watched followed me everywhere I went. Even in my own home, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Every time I turned a corner or glanced in a mirror, I half expected to see something that wasn't there. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something standing outside. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly pulled the curtain back. There was nothing there, but the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, and there, standing in the doorway, was Max. His eyes were wide, his body still as a statue. He wasn't barking, he wasn't moving, he was just watching. And then, in the dim light of the moon filtering through the window, I saw it. You may have survived that story, but the next one might just be your breaking point. I've always thought of myself as a rational person, the kind of guy who shrugs off ghost stories and laughs at superstitions. But sometimes, something happens that makes you question everything you've always believed. This is one of those stories, and even now, as I sit down to write it, I'm not sure what really happened. It all started on a Thursday night. I remember because it was one of those long, exhausting days at work, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch with a beer and zone out to some mindless TV. My job had me swamped with extra work, and I had spent the last 3 hours answering emails I didn't care about, pretending to be interested in things that didn't matter. By the time I got home, it was already dark. The streets were quiet, too quiet, really. It was that weird kind of quiet where you can hear every little thing, like the hum of the fridge or the ticking of the clock. I kicked off my shoes, grabbed a beer, and collapsed on the couch. The TV flickered to life, the comforting sound of voices filling the living room. I didn't even realize how tired I was until I started nodding off. I wasn't asleep, but I wasn't fully awake either. You know that space between dreams and reality? That's where I was when my phone rang. It startled me. It wasn't the usual soft ringtone I had set. It was loud, jarring, like a fire alarm going off in a quiet room. Groggy, I reached for the phone, squinting at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. No caller ID, just a string of numbers that didn't make sense. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but for some reason, I didn't. Maybe it was the unsettling quiet of the house, or maybe I was just too tired to think straight. Either way, I swiped to answer. "Hello?" My voice sounded rough, even to me. There was silence on the other end. Not the kind of silence you get when someone's thinking or waiting to speak, but a deep, empty silence, like the line was dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, checking the screen to make sure the call was still connected. It was. "Hello?" I said again, a little louder this time, feeling my pulse quicken. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I'm almost there. I blinked, unsure if I had heard it right. I sat up on the couch, fully awake now, heart pounding. What? Who is this? The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the call screen fading back to my home screen, my reflection staring back at me in the dim light of the TV. I tried to call the number back, but it didn't exist. It wasn't even a real number. The call log listed it as unknown. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to shake off the weirdness of it all. Maybe it was a prank call, I thought. Someone messing with me. It happens, right? People get weird calls all the time. I stood up, pacing the living room, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But there was something about that voice. I'm almost there. Almost where? Almost here? I checked the locks on the door, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned the deadbolt. Then I went to the windows, pulling the curtains shut, peeking through the small gaps in the fabric. The street outside was empty. No cars, no people, just the faint glow of the streetlight casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. For a while, I just stood there, staring out into the night, waiting for something. I don't know what, but nothing happened. No one came. No more calls. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. It was a prank, that's all. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But the tension wouldn't leave my body. Every small noise, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, made me jump. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark, but I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I barely slept. I kept hearing that voice in my head, over and over again. I'm almost there. What did it mean? Was it a joke? Some random person dialing a wrong number? The next day, I went to work, trying to shake it off, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy. But that night, as I sat down on the couch again, I felt that same unease creeping over me. And then my phone rang. The same ringtone, loud and piercing, the same unknown number. I stared at it, my heart racing. Every instinct told me not to answer, to just let it ring. But my hand moved on its own, and before I knew it, I had swiped to answer. Silence. Hello? My voice trembled this time. I'm almost there. I hung up immediately, throwing the phone onto the couch like it had burned me. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I stood up, pacing the room again, glancing at the windows, the doors, checking the locks. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. What was happening? Was someone watching me? Was this some kind of sick game? I tried calling the number back, but just like before, it didn't exist. It wasn't even a valid number. My call log showed nothing but unknown. The next few nights were the same. Every evening, just as I started to drift off, my phone would ring, and every time it was the same voice. I'm almost there. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't think about anything other than that voice. I even went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The number didn't exist, they said. It was probably just someone playing a prank. They told me to block the calls, but that didn't help. The calls kept coming, no matter what I did. And then, one night, the phone didn't ring. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had finally gotten bored and moved on. I tried to relax, to convince myself that everything was going to be okay. But then I heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the TV. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging their nails across the wood. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking as I moved toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. There was nothing, just the faint sound of my own breathing. But I knew that whoever had been calling me was now standing on the other side. I'm almost there. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and called the police. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, no one was outside. The street was empty, just like before. The calls stopped after that night. No more strange numbers, no more creepy whispers. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every time my phone rings, my heart skips a beat, and I hesitate before answering. Because deep down, I know they're still out there, and I know they're almost here.